Welcome to Midnight Sleep Scientist, where the day loosens its laces and the world remembers how to be quiet again. You are exactly on time. Not late, not early, simply arriving at the shore of a slow story, the kind that travels without hurry. Tonight, we wander into the gentle art of fossilization, the patient way the earth sometimes chooses to keep a memory. Most lives, perhaps almost all, dissolve back into the ongoing chorus of soil and sea. But here and there, in certain sheltered places, water becomes a careful archivist, and sand learns to hold, and something that once breathed leaves a trace the future can read. Let your shoulders settle, as if layers of fine silt were drifting down in a soft rain. Imagine a river unwinding its silver ribbon through a plain, leaving quiet deltas where reeds sway and dragonflies write brief letters in the air. Picture a seaside shelf, low and untroubled, where currents fade and the night falls like a blanket across a long, shallow room. In such rooms, the old ones, the patient ones, time conducts a slow translation. Bone becomes instruction, leaf becomes whisper, footprints become the shadow of a step. None of it happens quickly. None of it is certain. And that uncertainty, too, is something we'll hold with care. We'll travel by lantern light through the stages, pausing often, never rushing. We'll begin at the moment after motion, when stillness returns and the ordinary work of decay resumes. We'll watch for that rare relief when a blanket of sediment arrives like first snow and gently says, "Rest." We might drift with groundwater through microscopic corridors carrying minerals that learn the shape of porous bone. We may notice how absence writes its own story, casts molds and carbon films. The silhouettes of lost bodies will step quietly through rooms of amber, ice, tar and salt, where soft parts sometimes linger like forgotten lullabies. We'll visit exceptional beds of stone, where a whole community seems to pause mid-breath. And later still, we'll follow the careful hands that lift a rested fossil back into the light, without waking it. Brushes whispering, plaster jackets holding, museums becoming long, calm shelters. Along the way, we will keep a friendly skepticism close. Fossils are translations, not originals. Archives with pages missing, marginal notes smudged, whole chapters torn out by uplift and rain. We'll listen gently, ask softly, and leave a little space for the unknown. If we interpret, we'll do so in pencil. If we marvel, we'll also exhale. You might feel the room around you. Its temperature, its steady hush, like a shallow sea settling at dusk. If you'd like, you can imagine holding a smooth river stone. It's cool at first, and then it learns the warmth of your hand. In a way, that is what rocks do with time. They learn what touched them. They keep a softened print, a dream of contact. Tonight, we simply notice that possibility, and let the noticing become restful. In this unhurried journey, you are allowed to drift. The chapters will carry on like a tide, whether your thoughts wander or your eyelids lower. The story is patient. It has already waited for millions of years. It can certainly wait for you. If you're still awake later, you're welcome to whisper a tiny hello, perhaps share where you're listening from tonight, or the fossil that once captured your curiosity, even if it was only a shell with a little spiral that fit your thumb. For now, we begin. There is a hush that follows every life's last movement. It is not dramatic. It rarely looks like the endings we make in our stories. It's an ordinary quiet, like a room where someone has just set down a book and stepped into another part of the house. In that first minute, the world remembers what it always does with remains. It welcomes them back. Air moves across skin. Heat begins to leave. Microbes that were already there, faithful housemates, wake into a slightly different rhythm. If there is water nearby, its cool palm presses lightly. If there is sun, it leans in, curious, and then it too moves on. Scavengers might arrive, not as villains but as participants. Crows, crabs, beetles whose work is as old as the wind. Most of what once lived will join this gentle, efficient cycle. It is not failure, it is the plan. In forests, leaves soften into loam, and loam becomes part of the next spring's green. On open shores, waves unspool what was tightly woven, thread by thread, then trade it to sand. On grasslands, A low chorus of tiny jaws and patient fungi returns protein to the soil. In deserts, the sun writes a dry law that speaks of brittleness and wind. In each case, the movement is toward anonymity, toward that wide, generous pool of matter from which other lives will draw. For a fossil to begin, something else must happen. Not a miracle, exactly, more a small mercy of timing. A blanket of sediment arrives early before air and teeth and rain can undo too much. Mud slides off a riverbank in a slow sigh after a storm. Volcanic ash drifts down like pale snowfall. A sandbar shifts and settles. A lake overflows and then calms, relaxing into quiet layers. The body, or a part of it, finds itself tucked into this new room, sheltered from oxygen, buffered from motion, wrapped, not perfectly, but well enough. We might imagine the first hours. A fish settles into the cool bed of a lake, slow silt softening around it. Fins that once flickered become still, then held. Or the fallen frond of a fern lies upon clay, and the next rain presses it close, like a letter between pages, or a beetle, glossy and intent, missteps in the golden tack of resin, and is stilled mid-scuttle, a small, shining comma in a sentence that will take eons to read. Each scene suggests the same thing, an interruption in the usual dissolving, a pause. Even here, nothing is guaranteed. Burial is a beginning, not a promise. The chemistry of decay continues, just slowed, often redirected. Water remains in the story, always. It might, in time, carry dissolved minerals through tiny spaces, where they will precipitate and learn the map of both, or it might not. The pages could be lifted, folded, eroded, eaten from below by burrowing lives, overturned by a root seeking darkness. The earth is a restless librarian, its shelves but let's stay close to the hush. The phrase "the moment after motion" can also belong to us. You feel it when you arrive home, and your keys rest on the table. When the last tram of the evening glides away and the metal rail vibrates, then stills. That's the feeling we hold. In it, there is room for patience, for small processes to begin, invisible at first. If we could step through minutes and hours like pages, what would we see? In the first day, oxygen does what it does, reaching into tissues, letting their bonds loosen. Microbes celebrate in quiet ways. In the second day, the place itself, whether riverbed or dune foot, cave floor or basin, speaks more loudly. In water, currents decide if they will cradle or displace. On land, temperature swings write their jagged lines. Scavengers, if they can, continue their work. Each place has its signature, its style of returning. That style, more than the creature's identity, will often decide the future of any fossil to be. Under a delta's slow drift, the light dims early. Silt settles like snow in a room where windows never open. This is good for memory. Grains fill spaces, cover edges, press down broad plains. On a quiet seafloor, especially where oxygen runs thin, the little factories of decay must work with fewer tools. The job slows. A leaf on a lakebed, breathless and flat, begins to trade its body for a likeness. Carbon drawn down into a paper-thin film. A silhouette finer than ink. In a cave, dripping calcite builds ceilings and floors. Sometimes it glazes a fallen bat's wing, or a seed husk, sealing a tiny vault. In permafrost, the cold is a strict librarian, closing the book mid-sentence and setting it back on the shelf to be opened later by warm hands. Time passes in uncounted breaths. Weeks become months. The grains above compress, a little more each year. Pores in bone, those fine honeycombs that once housed blood and marrow, become avenues, then galleries, then archives. Water whispers down those halls, carrying tiny guests. Silica, calcite, iron. Some set down their parcels and stay. Others pass through. The original material, hydroxyapatite, collagen, changes, bargains, rearranges. Sometimes minerals replace it, sometimes they simply fill what emptiness they find. Either way, the object that remains is both old and new, a translation crossed with a portrait. Most bodies still leave no such trace. Storms lift and tear, soil turns, burrows thread, the horizon tilts. An ancient sea climbs to become a mountain, then wears back to a hill. Outcrops peel like slow fruit. In all this, the few that keep their shape do so because of a local kindness. A sudden blanket of ash, a stagnant basin, a sandbar shifting at just the right hour. Chance is not a random dice here. It is 1,000 small choices made by weather and water. The record is biased, the archivist idiosyncratic. We will remember this when we read later. Pencil in. There's another quiet truth. Even a perfect fossil is a conversation between matter and memory. If a shell dissolves but leaves a mold in the surrounding rock, we learn by absence. If a track hardens because a sun-baked surface was sealed by a quick rain and more mud, we read a step, not the foot. If a feather's barbs print as a film while the raches is lost, we hold a silhouette that suggests flight, not the bird. It is enough. The tenderness of these partial records is part of their gift. Perhaps you remember a museum case, a long jaw held in a gentle arc of white supports, or a fern pressed so fine you could follow each vein with a fingertip. The room smelled faintly of dust and varnish and the whisper of pages. People floated past in soft shoes. A child asked a question that made an old man smile. Even if you do not remember such a visit, you may have held a beach pebble with a spiral on it, smudged by time, surprisingly precise. That feeling of something having endured, not because it fought, but because it rested in the right place, is our companion tonight. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a feather settling in shallow water. The day is warm, the air mild. You drift down onto fine mud and lie there, light as a thought. Then clouds thicken, and a small storm slides across the base. Rain pocks the surface, and the wash brings a veil of silt, which sighs down and covers you. It is cool in the new dimness. You do not move. The storm moves on. Sun returns to the surface. But you are below now, in a quiet that deepens season by season. Years later, a new layer arrives. Decades later, another. Pressure persuades water out of the mud. The mud becomes rock. Within it, where you once lay, carbon clings in a faint, delicate map. One day, someone will split a slab and open a book that has been closed a very long time. There you are, not as you were, but as a shadow of yourself, still telling your small story. We could track the hours of a larger body too. A grazing animal collapses beside a river in a season of flood. The water rises gently, then quickly, and in that flood a bank slides, a little landslide that folds over the body and pins it in place. Teeth leave their usual signatures, ribs nibbled, limb ends missing, but much remains, held in the wet embrace of silt. Over months, gases find their way out. Over years, bones settle into alignment with the grains around them, a posture of long rest. When the river abandons this channel and cuts a new path, the old bed dries, then hides under a floodplain. Far above, seasons collect. In this way, fossilization is not an event, but an acceptance. The world makes a room, and the body agrees to lie down there and become text. The text may be legible or smudged, long or brief, poetry or a grocery list. Whatever its form, it belongs to the same library of quiet layers, where wind and water serve as patient scribes. We might ask, softly, why we care, why this long conversion of bone to stone, leaf to film, track to raised print, reaches into our night and comforts us. Perhaps it is because we, too, like to be held by context, to know that we are part of a longer unfolding, where even our fade into the background is a gift to those who follow. Perhaps it is because the idea of being remembered, not as a complete account, but as a tone, a shape, a silhouette, is enough. It is gentle to think so. As this chapter settles, feel how your own room holds you. The furniture does not shift. The air learns your temperature and stays. Far away, rivers are still writing, page after page, into deltas no one will read for a very long time. Somewhere, a fern frond is being pressed into a letter it did not know it was writing. Somewhere else, bones are learning the slow grammar of minerals. The planet keeps its patient pace. In the next quiet stretch, we will follow that first blanket of sediment more closely. We'll visit the soft pillows of mud and the calm beds of sand where so much of this story begins. For now, Allow the thought to rest. Most of life returns to the pool, and sometimes, with the help of water and luck, a trace remains. Both outcomes are kind. Both belong. The moment after motion has passed, the layers above are settling, and you are being carried, lightly, into the calm. Night comes early on the wide, flat places where rivers slow and think, and set down what they've been carrying all day. Picture a plain where the water loosens its braid, splits, and meanders like a tired traveler choosing the softest route home. The air is warm, a little damp far upstream. A mountain was shaved grain by rain, and those bright fragments rode the current until the music of the river gentled, and the grains, one by one, let go. They fall as if remembering gravity again. Sand first, then silt, then the finest dust, each finding its quiet place, each making a layer you could touch with the tip of your finger and feel nothing but smoothness. We are arriving at the first true shelter in our story. Burial. A tucked-in moment. The blankets are mineral, the pillows are mud. When water spreads out, it rests. Resting water holds less in suspension. Particles drift down, like snow in a clear night, until the bottom is a soft bed of tiny decisions. If a body arrives here, leaf, shell, bone, frond, and if the timing is kind, the new layers arrive quickly enough to protect it from the busy oxygen in the water, the patient teeth of small mouths, the stirring feet of those who live on the bottom. That quick cover is everything. It is not dramatic, it is a hush. You can feel it, if you like, in your own room. The weight of your blanket, learning your shape, the way a pillow receives your head and says, stay a while. A delta is a quilt made by a river. Each season stitches a square. Spring floods, summer calms, autumn rains, winter's low, clear flows. Over years, the quilt grows and shifts, and old squares tuck under new ones. In the quiet of a lake, the quilt is even finer. Some lakes keep a diary. You can read with a careful knife. Winter lays pale, fine pages. Summer writes darker, coarser ones. Layer, year. In some languages of geology, these are called varves, but tonight we can just call them breaths. A body that comes to rest between two of these breaths can be held with surprising tenderness. On a calm sea floor, especially where the water grows thin in oxygen, the work of decay slows to a yawn. Grains settle in silky drifts. Every storm far away sends a muted echo, an extra coverlet of sand that arrives like a guest who doesn't stay, only leaves a gift and slips away. In deeper settings, underwater avalanches, turbid flows, lay down graded beds, coarser at the bottom, finer at the top, as if the sea exhaled carefully in order. These too can be gentle rooms. Mud has a reputation for mess, but in the story of fossils it is a remarkable host. It is made of tiny plates, like little pages. When they settle, they stack with whispered order. The spaces between are small, and in those tight spaces, oxygen has less room to wriggle in. Microbes find fewer open doors, and scavengers, for once, are kept at a polite distance. In mud, a leaf becomes a letter. In mud, a feather becomes a sigh, pressed into memory. In mud, the outline of a fish can be held as if sleep were contagious. Sand does something different. Its grains are larger, rounder. They leave more room for water to wander, and later for minerals to travel. Sand can hold the shape of a shell beautifully, filling and hugging its interior like a moldable cushion. It can capture a footprint and keep it, especially if the next layer arrives before wind or wave can meddle. On a tidal flat, where ripples walk in step with the moon, a single quiet day can print a trackway that tells of a pause, a turn, a sudden little burst of speed. Then the tide brings a thin sheet of finer silt and seals the scene. Of course the opposite happens, often. Animals burrow, stirring the pages. Crabs and worms and small fish write their own labyrinths. Not maliciously, just living. We call this bioturbation when we want a larger word, but it is simply life's way of editing the archive. On a sandbar, waves can erase a whole afternoon. On a riverbank, a flood can lift what was gently set down and carry it to a new address. The book is written in erasable pencil, but sometimes, for reasons that feel almost like kindness, the edit's slow and the page survives long enough to harden. Think of storm seasons, Rains come heavy and long, and the river swells, flirts with its levees, and when it is most full of itself, slips over the edge in a broad, shallow fan. The sudden rush drops silt in a feathered pattern across the floodplain, light near the edge, thicker closer to the breach. These are crevasse splays, but tonight they can be thought of as handprints of water on land. If a small creature lay there, or a copse of plants fell, this sheet of new mud could tuck them in before the scavengers are fully awake. A week later, the river returns to its bed as if nothing happened. The handprint dries, the page remains. Some deltas breathe in larger rhythms. A channel that has been loyal for centuries will grow bored perhaps, or simply heavy with its own sediment, and it will find a new way to the sea. Abandonment here, adoption there. The old path sleeps, the new path sings. The sleeping path collects ponded water, marshes, low lakes. In those still rooms, the softest particles choose to stop, and through seasons of calm, memories accumulate. You might walk a dry, cracked mudflat today, and see little polygons where water once evaporated, their edges curling like old paper. Imagine those cracks softening again under a brief rain, the edges falling back into place, the surface smoothing. Then another layer arrives and the pattern is pressed, faint but real, into the earth's notebook. Even small things, the path a snail took, the burrow of a shrimp, the idle drag of a tail, can be recorded when the bed is soft and the cover is timely. There are quiet tricks that help. Microbial mats, thin carpets of tiny lives, can bind the surface of mud so that it resists scuffing, holding ripples and prints more faithfully until that sealing layer comes. In some ancient shores and tidal flats, these living films made the difference between a day's memory and a million-year letter. All the while, gravity does its slow work. Layers weigh on layers. Water is pressed out. Mud becomes shale, silt becomes siltstone, sand becomes sandstone. In the squeeze, grains lock a little closer. The pillow becomes firmer, the blanket tighter. If a life lies between these pages, it is now in a quieter room still. Darker, cooler, less busy with chemical chatter. Decay never truly stops, but it dozes. We can let time stretch now, as if the horizon were a rubber band that barely remembers its original shape. Imagine tens of thousands of years as a slow turning in your sleep. The river laces and unlaces. Sandbars migrate like slow thoughts. Deltas blink and shift their fans. Lakes deepen, fill with their own sediments, and shallow again. Shorelines step landward when the sea rises, then walk back out as it falls. Each motion is a careful rearranging of where blankets fall and pillows settle. Each motion is a new chance for the rare, sheltered rest that lets a fossil begin. Sometimes volcanoes participate, not with fire in the air, but with ash in the wind. A faraway eruption whispers across continents. The ash arrives like pale snow, very fine, very even, covering leaves, fish, the mild chaos of a summer shoreline. It seals, quickly, what was there. Under such sheets, soft parts can linger. Under such sheets, a skeleton may remain articulated, bones still teaching one another their original positions. Ash, too, can be a kind archivist, and sometimes the story is a tumble. A riverbank fails in one long shrug. A dune face slips and buries what had crossed it moments before. A shelf edge underwater slumps, and pours its load into deeper darkness. These sudden blankets aren't gentle exactly, but they are decisive. They make rooms out of movement, rooms out of collapse, rooms where oxygen is scarce and teeth are absent. Not every room will keep its guest, but enough do that museums are full of their quiet thanks. It is easy to fall in love with the idea that fine mud is always better than coarse sand for memory. Often it is. Yet there are places where sand shines as a recorder. Think of a river abandoning a channel and leaving behind a crescent of point bar sand. That curve, later cemented, could cradle bone like a nest. Think of a beach where storms, one after another, stack sheets of sand with barely a whisper of silt between. The spaces left, those tiny hallways between grains, become pathways for mineral waters later on. And the story of permineralization will happily take those routes. Mud makes silhouettes and subtle pressings. Sand builds frameworks that can take a breath of stone. Even so, Most lives here return to the pool. A flood later, an oxbow lake dries. A burrower refurbishes its tunnel and erases an outline without meaning to. Roots pry. Ice wedges hint, and then insist. The quilt is always being rearranged. Our archivist, Water, has a memory but also a taste for movement. It writes, then writes again over what it wrote. The bias is toward the busy places. Near shore environments make a lot of pages and turn them quickly. Deep basins write slowly, but their pages are less disturbed. Each environment carries its own style of forgetting. Perhaps you've pressed a flower in a book. Weeks later you open to the place and meet a delicate shadow of color, a brittle form still recognizable, the veins like fine handwriting. Burial, under pages, is an old human echo of what lakes and deltas do. We share the impulse to keep a shape, to honor an outline. We know that touch changes things, so we press softly. The earth does the same, at a scale that barely notices us. Take a short walk through time with me. A deer-like animal crosses a floodplain at dusk and lies down near a channel. The night is cool. In the dark hours, a storm upstream sends a pulse. The river climbs its banks, not with a roar here, but with a slow, shallow spread, a comforter of water and suspended silt that curls across the grass. It isn't deep, but it is thorough. The body is covered to the knees, then to the shoulders. Grasses bend under the weight. Seeds float, then settle. By morning, the water is falling back, leaving a new thin sheet of mud that glints like satin. A day later, tiny prints, birds, small mammals, stipple the surface. Then dry weather seals the page. Weeks pass. The next flood lays another sheet. The parts above the mud are carried away by teeth and time. But what lies within the first sheets remains in its quiet envelope. Or, let's visit a lake in winter. Ice closes the surface, and the water underneath is still as a held breath. From the inflowing stream, a trickle of clay-sized particles drifts, steady as dust in a sunbeam. They accumulate on the bottom in a pale layer thin as a whisper. In spring, the melt and 1,000 small landslides send darker, sandier layers down. Light, dark. Light, dark. Between two of those pages, a fish, a leaf, a dragonfly rests. The ice is a guardian for months. The pages above and below are gentle. Years later, when the lake is a meadow and the meadow is a town, and then the town is a memory, a stonecutter will split a slab and meet the outline of a leaf, so fine the midrib's small tributaries look like rivers of their own. The pillow of mud will have done its work. We can even imagine a shore where microbial mats make the mud cohesive, the surface elastic like warm wax. A dinosaur steps on it, presses down, lifts. The mat holds the shape overnight. A thin layer of silt arrives with the next tide and tucks it in. Another step, another bedspread. A week later, the scene looks ordinary. Ripples, flatness. But inside the stack, a sentence is written in the syntax of feet. They will lie there for a span that makes even mountains fidget. One day a boot will scuff the rock and reveal a toe mark. Someone will call out. A trail of steps will lead into stone distance. For a few minutes on a warm afternoon, time will be exquisitely clear. Burial is not only about bodies, it also keeps small chorographies. A school of fish that turned all at once when ash dimmed the water. Leaves arranged by a gentle eddy into a rosette. Jellyfish outlines, rare and wobbling, set by a sudden sealing layer before the day's heat could undo them. These are the soft records. They need quiet. They need closing. There are colors in these rooms. Iron leaves browns and reds when it oxidizes. Rusty hues that feel like autumn under shallow seas. In anoxic muds when sulfur has a say, pyrite may bloom in tiny cubes, fool's gold blinking from a dark shale. Calcium carbonate writes in pale creams, silica signs with glassy hardness. The quilt is not only texture but palette. If you have ever turned over a stone by a river and seen a wink of something bright, you've glimpsed how chemistry writes in these folded beds. All of this might sound busy. Yet, when we step back, the feeling is calm. The planet is, across the long arc, a place where particles seek rest. Gravity is a lullaby, always playing. and water is the hand that smooths sheets. If you press your palm to your chest now, you can feel a different tide, quieter, rhythmic. The room is its own basin, the blankets are their own deltas. The breath you let go settles like silt and makes a small layer of peace. Our caveats walk softly beside us. We remember that for every layer that kept a shape, there are thousands that did not. We remember that some records are edited by creatures who prefer their own burrows over our desire for legibility. We remember that wind and uplift and rain are tireless librarians who reshelve whole bookcases without notice. We remember that biases are baked into the archive. Shorelines tell more stories than open oceans. Quiet lakes gossip about leaves more than bones. Mountains hoard their memories until their turn comes to lay grain at a river's feet. Yet, enough remains that we can speak of blankets and pillows and not feel like we are inventing comfort. The comfort is geological. It belongs to deltas and basins, to quiet floors, to storm gifts, laid carefully, to ash that came from a day of thunder and lava, and yet arrived as softness. If a child asked why mud is kinder than air to a fallen leaf, we might say, because mud slows the voices that want to rearrange the leaf into other things. Because in mud the leaf can tell its story before it must become soil again. Because mud listens longer. If the same child asked why sand is a good bed for shells, we might say, because sand is willing to take an impression, like a cushion that remembers for a while, and because later when waters carrying minerals wander the halls between sand grains, they will have room to strengthen the memory. Simple answers, perhaps, but simple is restful tonight. And so we stand with the river at dusk, watching eddies lean into one another and set down their burdens. We sit with the lake at noon, clear and glassy, as a small cloud passes and a handful of dust finds the bottom. We walk a winter shoreline and laugh quietly at the thought that the lines the wind pushes into sand might, with a quick rain and a fortunate covering, last far beyond our names. The blankets are in place. The pillows are fluffed. Rooms have been made that no one will enter for a very long time. Somewhere, under new layers, a shape closes its eyes. Soon water will learn the shape of bone more intimately. It will move through porous spaces with tiny gifts of mineral, and what was once a scaffold for blood and marrow will become a scaffolding for stone, but that is the next chapter's patience. For now, rest in the image of a broad, slow river, letting go of its brightness, of grains of sand arriving like quiet footfalls, of mud settling like thought at the end of a long day. The page turns without a sound. The quilt grows a square, and you sink a little deeper into your own gentle pillow, held by the same world that holds what it once set down. Down in the dim rooms we visited, a little below the blankets of sand, beneath the pillows of mud, there is a constant visitor that never knocks. It moves through every door left ajar, carries faint cargo, lingers in quiet corners, and then goes on. Water, unassuming, tireless, patient, learning what a body once was, and practicing how to keep its outline. If you could lie where the bones lie and listen, the soundtrack would be soft, not the hiss of a river's surface, but the slow seep of groundwater, the tick of droplets through pores, the whisper of ions letting go of one bond and taking up another. The rooms are cool, a little mineral scent. The former warmth of muscle and blood has been replaced by the slower warmth of the earth itself, the kind you might feel when you touch a stone that has been lying in the sun all afternoon. Here, there is no rush. Here, even change has a lullaby. Bone is already a compromise between strength and lightness, a honeycomb of tiny beams and chambers designed to hold blood, to flex, to heal. After burial, that honeycomb becomes an invitation. Water enters because it can, because gravity writes in downward strokes and pressure nudges, because gradients in chemistry are like open arms. In the pause, water is more than a liquid. It is a courier. It brings dissolved minerals, invisible until the moment they decide to stay. We often call what follows permineralization, a long word for a gentle habit. Minerals settling into empty spaces, turning hollowness into substance. Slowly, so slowly dissolved silica can gather in those small bone galleries. Like mist becoming frost on a window, calcite might come instead. The same mineral that shells and stalactites choose. Iron too can arrive, leaving ochres and umbers that look like autumn captured in stone. Each mineral has its own style of settling, its own way of using water's whisper to find a home. None rush, they do not need to, time is on their side. This is not yet replacement, not yet the swapping of one material for another. In permineralization, bone's original lattice remains, its scaffolding of calcium phosphate, the delicate architecture of spongy tissue and dense shaft. While the spaces are filled, think of snow drifting into the panels of a garden trellis, making a solid white wall out of air and wood. Think of a potter pouring slip into a fine wicker basket and letting it set. The shape is strengthened by what enters, not erased by it. The result is a bone that can survive the squeeze of deepening burial, a bone whose tiny halls have been buttressed by stone. Yet water is rarely content with a single task. It can also unmake while it makes, dissolve even as it deposits. This, quietly, is replacement. If the original mineral bone's hydroxyapatite begins to dissolve, water may offer a substitute that copies the form while changing the substance. Silica may take the place of phosphate. Calcite may settle where collagen once threaded. Molecule by patient molecule, the original gives way, and a duplicate grows in its place, faithful to small curves and dents, sometimes faithful enough to confuse the eye. It is as if the world were tracing its own drawing, saying softly, "I will keep the line." There are subtler shifts too. Recrystallization reshapes without rewriting, arranging the same molecules into larger, more stable crystals, like a choir finding harmony without changing the song. Under a microscope, the chorus looks different, more orderly, less fragile. To the hand, the fossil feels sturdier, heavier, more stone than bone. And yet the old pattern is there, the signature of blood channels, the delicate trabeculae, the faint stitching of growth rings. We might let examples wander in, not as exhibits behind glass, but as friendly companions. Petrified wood, for instance, is an open invitation to imagine water taking careful notes. A fallen tree is buried in ash or sediment. Its cells, the tiny rooms where sap flowed, where sunlight's gift was stored, become slow passageways, silica in groundwater, often derived from volcanic glass, edges into those lumens and settles. The walls themselves may dissolve and be replaced, or may simply be supported by infill. Years slip into centuries, centuries into spans so long we stop saying the numbers aloud. The log that sleeps beneath the surface is, finally, a book written in chalcedony. When someone lifts it into the air, the rings are still legible, the rays still fan, the bark's texture still whispers tree. The weight is otherworldly and reassuring at once. It did not endure by refusal, but by agreement. In some places, silica chooses to play differently, signing its name as opal, hydrated, timidly glassy, sometimes with little fires of color trapped inside. Shells, bones, even the delicate arches of tiny snails have been opalized in dry lands, where water came rarely but brought enough dissolved silica that, with patience, it could replace what it admired. A spiral you could balance on a fingernail becomes a pale, luminous curve, its surface catching light as if the sea still lives in it. Calcite has its own territories. In limey settings, where the water swirls with carbonate, like milk, stirred into tea, it can fill bones generously. The result glows softly when polished, cream and honey, hinting at warm shallows and reef-bright afternoons. Even if the original body knew something quite different, the bond between calcite and memory is strong, but not unbreakable. Acids will brush it away if given the chance, a reminder that every preservation is a compromise. Iron writes with bolder ink. In the absence of much oxygen, where certain bacteria breathe differently and sulfur begins to whisper, iron can pair with sulfur to form pyrite, fool's gold lining shells, replacing tissues, building tiny cubic galaxies in dark shells. Pyritization is a rarer script, often tied to still waters and quick burial, and it sometimes favors soft parts, the gills of a fish, the frill of a worm, the fabric of a leaf. Under a lamp, such fossils wink as if they had found a way to keep starlight. Phosphate, the original mineral of bone, can sometimes lead the preservation of things that were never bony at all. In places where phosphate drifts heavily in water, perhaps because of decaying richness all around, soft tissues, even fragile ones, may mineralize early, catching shapes that usually vanish. Tiny embryos, the architecture of a muscle, the hint of a gut's gentle loop, have all been kept by swift phosphatization, a kind of emergency copy made when conditions align, then tucked safely under deepening pages. All of these ways, filling, replacing, rearranging, belong to a wider family of changes called diagenesis. The word sounds formal, but the act is intimate. It is what happens to sediments and their guests after burial. But before they become part of the tectonic grand opera, diagenesis decides whether a shell remains aragonite or settles into the calmer geometry of calcite. It decides whether bone is a whisper or a statement, whether a fish is a shadow or a sculpture. It is a conversation, always between water and what water finds. We can soften the science by visiting familiar corners of our own lives. The kettle that builds a crust of scale on its interior, that is calcite precipitating from hard water, an impatient cousin to the slow work happening underground. The bathroom tile that grows an orange film where iron runs, that is the same palette appearing in miniature. The stalactites that lengthen drop by drop from a garden cave ceiling that is mineral in motion, guided by water's clean handwriting. If we can accept how a teacup records its own history in faint rings, we can accept that a bone can ask water to remember it. There is a sweet caveat to keep with us. Words like permineralization and replacement sound tidy, but in rock the boundaries are blurry. A single bone may be part original mineral, part recrystallized self, part silicified, part iron-touched. The same fossil, if we could slice it into 100 cross-sections, might tell 100 micro-stories, each with a slightly different cast of mineral characters. The record is rarely pure, purity is not the aim. Survival, it might be helpful to walk through a timeline, lightly, like fingers drifting over piano keys. After burial, the earliest hours belong to chemistry loosening what life had tightened. As oxygen thins and microbial bustle grows muffled, spaces open. Days lengthen into months. Poor water rich with whatever the surrounding sediment offers begins to circulate with purpose. Early cements may form outside the bone first, stitching nearby grains together into a protective sheath, a quiet casing that reduces later crushing. Inside, the long corridors of the bone welcome their visitors. Silica accumulates where it is in excess. Calcite where carbonate whispers loudest. Iron where redox boundaries draw a line between what dissolves and what stands. Over years and decades, the architecture strength. Over longer spans, replacement may add its steady hand, trading the original for a close cousin that bears the same face to the world. Then come the great compressions, the tempering by depth and time. Water is squeezed from muds, sand grains click into more secure embraces. The fossil no longer a fragile ghost, no longer a thing that could snap at a touch, becomes a citizen of rock. Diagenesis continues, slow and sure, even as the layers above shift their weight. Only much later, when the earth folds and lifts, when erosion removes the quilt one coverlet at a time, when wind is a sculptor and rain is a chisel, does the fossil drift back toward daylight. It is usually heavier now, different in color, richer in resonance when your fingernail taps it. No longer bone, and yet. People sometimes ask whether a petrified bone is truly the bone itself. The answer might be a smile and a nod that leans both ways. It is itself in form, its ornament, its growth lines, the tiny grooves where ligaments once anchored, the marrow's mat. It is not itself in matter. Its molecules have been traded like letters in a long correspondence. The original paper slowly replaced until only the handwriting remains. The mind can hold both truth gently, the way we hold a childhood photograph that is yellowed but faithful. There are biases tucked into this chapter of our journey, and it is kind to name them softly. Bones with larger pores make better hosts for mineral guests. Dense, compact bones may resist, or be so slow to accept help that they crush before they can be propped. Environments that feed water with dissolved silica, carbonate, iron, the very surroundings that supply, tend to produce more robust fossils. Places of constant flushing may erase as quickly as they fill. Where oxygen seeps in freely, even a well-buried bone may lose ground. Where oxygen is scarce, even soft tissues might enjoy a brief, astonishing tenure. We remember, no single rule replaces the humility of the particular. Parallel patterns are everywhere once you start to notice them. Frost finds cracks in a wall and writes lace there, night after night, rendering the brick stronger and more beautiful until a thaw reverses its art. Minerals find cracks in bone and write their own lace. Permanent because it is protected, elegant because physics favors certain shapes. A mason knows how mortar wicks into the spaces between stones, how it sets, how it carries load. Groundwater knows the same, and carries a cathedral's patience into places no mason can see. Even within us, small repairs mirror large ones. Calcium patches microfractures as we live, an internal diagenesis that keeps us steady. The earth, without hurry, continues the repair long after we are gone. Perhaps we pause to hold a familiar fossil in our imagination. A vertebra the size of your palm, warm from being handled in a museum's gentle light. The surfaces are smooth, where fingers have polished them. On the cut face, a constellation of tiny round openings looks back, once passages for blood, now sweets filled with mineral. You might feel its unexpected weight, the way it asks your muscles to pay attention. You might appreciate how the center still hints at flexibility, a saddle where another bone once nestled. The person guiding the group says that water made this possible. You nod, not because you have traced every chemical step, but because you have felt water do similar things where you live. A kettle's lime, a cave's drip. The way the city's pipes sing differently after a hard winter. In some beds of extraordinary kindness, those we will visit when we arrive at Lagerstätten, a compound process unfolds. There may be delicate permineralization of soft tissues early on, a skin of mineral-preserving lines that usually fade in the first day. There may be a veneer of iron sulfide, outlining a fin or a feather's barbs. Beneath, bones accept silica, or calcite. Above, a layer of fine ash seals the page before it can be smudged. When such a slab splits in a lab's quiet room, the lights of many processes shine at once, each a small miracle stacked into one. But even ordinary stones carry the story beautifully. In a sandstone channel for a long-vanished river, a jumble of limb bones rests shoulder to shoulder. Some are filled to their cores with sparkling quartz, clear enough that sunlight seems to move within. Others have calcite hearts and iron-stained skins. A few are partly hollow still, where mineral waters did not quite finish their rounds. Each is a variation on a theme, like a family of voices singing the same melody in different registers. It may ease the mind to know that this chapter's work does not demand our vigilance. Water does not need us to stand guard. Mineral does not require our schedule. The world is full of laboratories without walls, where experiments run on their own clocks, longer than ours, and more forgiving. Our part is simply to notice, and in noticing, find rest. If you place your hand on your own ribs, you can feel a different music, the quieter thrum of blood, the breath's slow tide. Inside that framework, bone is alive, attentive, renewing. One day, very far from tonight, when your frameworks and mine rejoin the larger story, the exchange might continue under mud or sand. Water might visit, curious and kind, with little parcels of mineral to leave in the rooms where our own blood once traveled. Even if it never happens, even if our traces are carried quickly into dark loam and warm sea and new leaves, the possibility is a soft comfort. It means the world is hospitable to memory. We close the door gently on this room now. We've watched water learn shapes. We've watched minerals grow calm. Inside borrowed structures, we've understood that permineralization is not a spell, but a habit, and that replacement, when it occurs, is a careful translation rather than an erasure. The bones in their beds are quieter than before, supported by stone where emptiness once was. The log sleeping under the old ash layer is more log than ash and more stone than wood, a pleasing paradox that makes sense when you don't push it. Above, blankets of sand still settle. Pillows of mud still receive. The archivist continues her rounds by lamplight only she can see, carrying silica in one hand, calcite in the other, iron glimmering in her pocket. She lingers where pores open, whispers to crystal seeds, tidies the corners of memory. You too can settle a little deeper now, as if a mineral were filling the spaces around your thoughts with something clear and supportive, as if the day itself were being permineralized into a gentle weight you no longer have to carry. The room holds its shape. Your breath is the tide in a small, safe basin. The earth below is very old and very good at keeping what it loves. In the next quiet chapter, We will trace how shadows in rock, casts, molds, and the thinnest of carbon films can hold a life by outlining absence rather than filling presence. For tonight, let water finish its lesson, learning the shape of bone, and let that patience teach your body how to rest. In certain beds of stone, the most eloquent things are not the things themselves, but their echoes. The first sight is often quiet. A slab splits with a soft clack under a field hammer, and on one face there is an oval hollow clean-edged smooth within, while on the matching face there is an oval rise that fits it perfectly. Nothing of the original creature remains, and yet its outline greets the light, shy and exact. Elsewhere, a leaf appears as a whisper-thin charcoal sheet, veins crisply branching like frost on a window. We are looking not at bodies, but at shadows the earth agreed to keep. This is the chapter of absence doing the work, of presence, of negatives becoming their own kind of positive, of silhouettes, impressions, and the delicate films that can outlast the flesh that cast them. In these rooms, the planet practices a softer form of memory. Let's begin with the simple magic of a mold. Imagine a shell, a coiled snail, say, sleeping under a shallow layer of silt. We have already reached the hush where oxygen thins and the busy mouths of scavengers cannot easily find purchase. The silt, pressed and patient, hardens into a rock that learns the outer curves of the shell, the way a pillow learns a cheek. If later the shell dissolves, traded away to groundwater one slow molecule at a time, what remains is the space it once occupied. An exterior mold, a negative of form, the precise recess where shell met mud. Run a fingertip along its edge and you trace the spiral in reverse, like reading a sentence from the end back to the beginning. Sometimes the story is the other way round. Sediment can seep into the interior of the shell while it still holds its shape. That infill hardens. Then the shell vanishes. The result is an interior mold, a steinchen, a stone kernel shaped like the inner room of the organism. These are humble marvels, quiet casts of a hidden space, like the impression your foot leaves inside a well-worn shoe. They speak of the architecture within the coil's tightness, the little shelves and ridges that once buttressed the living animal. Between these two, outside and inside, lies the possibility of a third voice, the cast. If an exterior mold waits patiently, it can be filled later by new minerals or sediments. The pore does not know the original, it only knows the cavity's invitation. When it sets, we meet a positive copy made from a negative memory. The cast stands where the body once stood, a replica not of substance but of shape. There is something gently theatrical about a cast in rock, as if the earth was staging a play with an empty costume and still moving us. In all of these, what we see is the story of a disappearing original and a faithful resting place. The shell goes, the space remains, the space is either cherished as it is, or refilled and offered back to us as a likeness. Molds and casts need no permineralized bone, no replaced tissues, only a decent seal and the willingness of stone to keep a contour. They are the planet's way of honoring outlines. If we wander a limestone quarry in our minds, there are countless such hollows and rises. A bivalve's twin valves leave twin ovals, one recessed, one proud. The ribs are there, fine and regular, with the occasional chip where a small accident happened 100 million years ago. Tiny snails crowd in clusters, each a punctuation mark. Sometimes the molds intersect, a conversation of curves where lives overlapped at the moment of burial. You can follow a fingertip across the rock, the way you might trace the stitching on an old quilt, reading the pattern by feel. Molds and casts attend more than shells. Wood can leave molds of bark, knot, and even the spaces beneath where insects once chewed galleries, their absence preserved as fluted channels. Burrows themselves, tubes through soft substrate, can be filled, harden, and survive as sinuous casts, the stone equivalents of a story told by someone who has already left the room. Roots do this too, leaving pitted verticals and branching lines, an underground map lifted to daylight. Even gas bubbles from decaying matter have, in certain volcanic sediments, left globes in stone, perfect negative spheres, that catch a bit of sky when water has rained into them. Casts of footprints and molds of skin textures feel especially close to us, perhaps because we understand the language of steps. On a day long ago, a body passed over soft ground, pressed down, lifted. The bed held the shape and, in the next breath of time, a sheet of finer sediment tucked it in. Later, that hollow filled and hardened. What we meet on a quarry wall is a raised version of a moment's pressure, a positive relief where once there was a depression, a cast of a step, a handprint of a passing. The original feet are long gone, their pressure remains like a memory embedded in the world's surface. Then there are the shadows that are not spaces, but stains. Carbon films. Picture a leaf reclining on clay at the bottom of a quiet lake, thin as a thought. In the days after burial, its lightest parts go first, whispering away as gases. What resists is the most stubborn fraction of itself, carbon-rich, flattened, compressed into a paper-thin layer. Over time, as clay becomes shale, this film persists as a silhouette, sometimes glossy, sometimes matte, often black against grey. The veins are delicate, branching with scientific neatness and artistic grace. A fish can be held this way, scales, fin rays, even a suggestion of eye rendered in a shadow of carbon that clings to the bedding plane, like a nighttime sketch. Carbonization is an economy of memory. Most of the original chemistry leaves. The essence stays as a smear that nevertheless carries structural information. It is closer to a rubbing than a sculpture, closer to a photograph than a statue. Yet, because it lies flush with the rock, it can feel intimate, like a fingerprint. The film is not thick. A breath might seem enough to lift it, though it holds for ages if rock keeps it safe. Some of the most tender plant records come from such films. Ferns that look freshly pressed, fronds splayed with their midribs straight and pinnate, alternating like careful notes. Conifers leave narrow needles in clusters. Cycads and ginkgos sign their presence with distinctive blades and fans. The films sometimes sit alongside depressions that capture surface texture without the carbon remaining, so that in splitting a slab, you might be given a negative and a shadow, two different whispers saying the same name. When the films preserve animals, the effect is hauntingly precise. The outline of a small fish at rest, mouth slightly parted, spine arcing in a gentle hiss, can make you feel you've arrived a moment too late to see a flick of tail. A jellyfish, rarely kept, has, in a few quiet lagoons of the deep past, been outlined as a soft disc with faintly suggested lobes, so improbable that we lean in close, smiling in disbelief. Delicate wings of insects splat into lace. The ache of seeing such fine things held by mere micrometers of carbon is balanced by the calm of understanding the conditions. Anoxic bottom waters, very fine sediment, quick sealing, that made such holding possible. We can appreciate without asking the record to be common. There is a cousin to carbon films that invites the eye differently. Impressions. Here the body or its part left a contour in soft sediment, but no film remained. When the rock split, the impression carried the skin of texture, a leaf's stomata as tiny pits, a trilobite's ridges, even the hint of wrinkles where an animal's soul met mud. These are molds of surfaces, sometimes with astonishing fidelity, and they ask little from chemistry beyond prompt burial and gentle pressure. They are not paintings, but embossings, messages written by touch. Think for a moment of all the ordinary marks a day can hold. Raindrops stipple a puddled surface, then a thin sheet of silt arrives and locks the pattern. A gust etches ripples in sand. A calm returns and seals them. A worm grazes in looping scrolls beneath the microbial skin, and the mat sags where the worm moved, later filled and preserved as a looping relief we can follow with a fingertip. Each is an impression, the shallowest of topographies holding a day's weather and appetite. They share a mood with carbon films, the mood of the ephemeral, unexpectedly extended. It might help to step gently through a sequence of how such shadows come to be. After our burial blankets fall, chemistry begins its quiet work. For shells and bones, dissolution can hollow spaces that molds then occupy. For leaves and fish, the loss is gas gently leaving, carbon concentrating, flatness asserting itself. If the bed within which all this happens remains undisturbed, no burrow is to rewrite the page, no currents to crumple it, then time allows hardening. Clay's plates align, compact and lock. Sand's grains cement. Void spaces might be reoccupied by late arriving minerals that pour into molds and lift them into casts. Carbon films find a partner in the clay minerals, sometimes bonding delicately. A union of softness and stone. There are biases here. We keep them in our pocket, like smooth pebbles we can touch when needed. Carbonization favors places with fine sediments and low oxygen, quiet lakes, deep bisons, some lagoons where the bottom breathes slowly. Molds and casts appear where shells were common, and soluble, where limestones cradle countless absent bodies whose shapes the rock learned. Impressions thrive where surfaces were briefly firm, mud just right for prints, microbial mats that bound grains, and where sealing arrived in time. None of these rules hold everywhere. All of them hold often enough that we can speak of tendencies with a gentle voice. If you like, we can visit a few vignettes, walking softly, so as not to wake anything. On a tidal flat in the deep past, a reptile with splayed limbs crosses a patchwork of ripples and microbial sheen. Each step presses a hand with its splayed fingers into the slightly elastic mud. A light wind corrugates the shallows. As tide turns, a milky wash of silt slides over the day's record, a fine lace thrown atop a bedspread. Months later, another sheet arrives. A season later, a storm places a coarser cover. The bed thick. When stone finally takes the place of mud, the trackway exists as a series of molds, palm-shaped hollows, waiting for a curious eye and a steady light. Perhaps later still, the hollows are naturally filled by sand from above, and harden. A cast trackway becomes a set of raised prints, steps in relief. The walker is long gone. The walk remains, a gentle insistence that a life once moved here. In a lake ringed with trees, autumn is an act of writing. Leaves let go during a wind that has climbed and fallen all afternoon. Their shapes settle through clear water to the bottom's whispering clay. Many decay. A few are tucked in quickly by a pulse of fine sediment from a tributary. Oxygen is scarce in the deeper water. Microbes work slowly. The winter adds a pale sheet of silt over the darker autumn page. By late spring, the layer is firm. The leaf is now a film. The veins a crisp, branching map that reads like a tiny river system. When someone lifts the slab, ages later, the leaf's shadow is cooler than the stone around it, a bruise of memory that never quite fades. On a shallow sea's floor, shells lie by the hundreds. Brachiopods, bivalves, ammonites, quiet as abandoned spoons. The sediment is limy, born from the lives of countless tiny plankton and the chalky rain of their bodies. Groundwater in this setting is friendly to dissolution. Aragonite surrenders readily. Shells vanish, one after another, leaving a honeycombed rock full of negative space. Later, mineral-rich water wanders through and chooses some cavities to fill. Not all. The rock becomes an anthology. Some pages are empty. Outlines. Some are casts you can hold. Others are both, depending on which face you cut. The child could feel the differences and understand the categories without a single word. There is tenderness in admitting that casts, molds, and films carry less direct chemistry from the original bodies than permineralized bones do. We are often looking at rock about rock, ink made of the earth, writing the earth. And yet, because form is information, because outlines and textures encode lives with startling specificity, these shadows can teach with a clarity that surprises us. The flex of a trilobite's thorax as it curled in defense is captured in relief. The domed bump of a dinosaur's skin scale, with a tiny central pit, meets the light of a prep table after 100 million nights. The wavering margin of a jelly body, ephemeral beyond belief, is clipped from shale and held in a gloved palm with awe that feels like holding breath. They teach, too, by reminding us how much is lost, and how gracefully meaning persists anyway. The cast does not tell us a shell's exact mineralogy, but it can tell us growth lines, ornament, overall form. An impression does not keep a leaf's color, but it preserves vein architecture, margin shape, the angle of attachment. A carbon film cannot save the depth of a fish's body, but it gives the outline, the fin positions, sometimes the hint of scale. We learn to love the silhouette, to gather patience from partiality. In our own lives, we have similar archives. The dent left in a cushion after someone stood up, the damp outline on a stone where you were sitting by a river, the way a page in a book retains the scent of a pressed blossom long after the blossom has been removed. Even the quiet ghost of a picture frame on a sun-faded wall. None of these hold the original. All of them hold its gesture. We read them daily, often without noticing, and adjust our stories kindly. There is a small craft to recovering such shadows without disturbing them. In the field, a preparator draws a knife through shale along the bedding plane, listening for the soft change in sound where a film might lie. The rock splits where it chooses, the film clings to one side. A sigh, a smile. In the lab, a brush sweeps away the dust of the opposite layer. A consolidant may be breathed in at the edges to keep the carbon from lifting. Light is angled low, so texture stands up in relief. Nothing is hurried. The goal, if there is one beyond respect, is to let the shadow remain a little longer in the open air. We can hear the refrains that shelter our thinking. The record is biased. Shadow fossils favor certain environments: quiet water, fine sediment, quick cover. The pages are edited. Borrows are tireless. Waves persuasive. Roots insist. The archive is partial by nature. For every fish film we find, 1,000 vanished without a trace. And that is not a tragedy, but the way a lively world works. Knowing these, we can love what we do find without needing it to be everything. There are moments when absence plays tricks that look like artistry. A shell leaves a perfect mold. The mold is later filled not by sediment, but by a mineral that grows crystals larger than the eye expects. The cast is then a shell shape made of glittering quartz or honeyed calcite, as if a creature had been recast in jewelry. We recognize the flourish as geology's own, not a signal of rarity beyond the conditions that allowed it. We can smile at the beauty and then soften our focus back to the comforting pattern outlines kept, hollows honored, films held fast. As night deepens around our narrative, it may be soothing to rest your attention on your own immediate shadows. The faint silhouette your body makes against the dim of the room, the soft valley in the mattress that remembers the shape of your ribs, the cool print your hand would leave if you lifted it now in the air above your blanket. These too are molds of a kind, transient but kind. When you settle again, the mold is filled. There is a cast of presence, warm and breathing. We end this chapter with the image we began with, two halves of a rock opening like a book. On one side, the negative, a hollow that invites the pad of the thumb and says something once rested here. On the other side, the positive, a rise that meets that hollow perfectly and says, and this is how it looked. Between them, a carbon trace might even write a third voice, a dark, thin film that says, and here is the softest part of what it was. 3 testimonies, none of them the original, all of them true enough to lead us gently. Above us, the blankets of sand and the pillows of mud continue to be laid. Below, water goes on learning the shapes we leave. In certain lucky rooms, absence will keep speaking for presence, and shadows will practice being strong. For now, let your own outlines loosen. Let the day dissolve like a leaf's lighter parts, leaving only a fine, restful film of memory that lies quietly beside you. The room holds your shape the way stone holds a mold. If you drift, the story will continue, toward libraries of deep time and the chapters where layers themselves become teachers. There is no need to carry it. The earth knows how to keep a gentle record. There is a canyon somewhere, perhaps you've walked one, or perhaps it lives only as a calm picture in your mind, where the walls lift like quiet bookshelves, and every shelf is a color of sleep, rust, cream, slate, row, each band a paragraph, each ripple a line break, each pebble a soft punctuation mark placed by water. Long ago, we step into that aisle at dusk. The heat is leaving the stone. Swallows fold into their pockets in the cliff. Far above, a thin ribbon of moon draws a white stitch across the deepening blue. Down here, the air is cool, sandstone cool, the kind of cool that remembers shade more than night. If you run a hand along the wall, you can feel the grain of the sentence, the way sand once moved, the way it settled, the way the world chose to keep it. We have arrived in the library of deep time. In this library, books lie one atop the other. The first rule is gentle and intuitive. What was laid down earlier is usually lower. What arrived later is usually higher. Geologists give it a proper name, superposition, but your body already knows it. Make a stack of blankets, and the first one is at the bottom. Bake a layered pastry, and the earliest layer sits beneath your newest. Rivers learn this rule without being taught. Lakes do too. seas do it absent-mindedly for ages on end. There is another rule that tends to be true at the start. Layers begin mostly flat. Not glass flat, not the way a mirror lies, but broadly horizontal, the way calm water finds itself. We call the habit original horizontality, but you've seen it each time a jar of muddy water settles on a windowsill. What later bends or tilts, what later stands on edge, was once a soft floor. The thought is grounding. Even the most contorted cliffs had an initial quiet posture, the posture of sleep. And there is a third kindness. Layers extend laterally, thinning at the edges, changing subtly in texture, but continuing across distance more than you might expect. You can trace a seam of grey shale, like a sentence that runs from one side of the room to the other, even when later quakes and rivers interrupt the line. Lateral continuity is not a promise. It is a habit. It allows us to read across gaps, to join two separated pages and call them one chapter again. These simple graces, older below, younger, originally flat, laterally continuous, form the grammar of the shelves. Other marks add punctuation. A layer that cuts across others like a blade tells you it must be newer than what it slices. Cross-cutting relationships are time's neat handwriting. Pebbles of one rock, trapped within another, say, "We were here first," then carried and embedded as clasts in something younger. Even ripples have a sequence. The steep side points the direction the current last leaned, a fleeting moment held as a subtle accent on the page. Within this grammar, fossilization sits like verses copied into margins. Bones tucked in mud, leaves pressed flat between fine pages, tracks sealed by a thin sheet of silt. The layers are not merely background, they are the shelves that allow the small stories to stand without falling, the calm architecture around which memory arranges itself. If we let our eyes walk up a canyon wall, the colors change as environments change. A pale, cross-bedded sandstone whispers dunes, wind working in quiet arithmetic, stacking little triangles called crossbeds, where sand slipped down leeward faces. Above it, a reddish mudstone suggests floodplains, slow water, careful deposits that held footprints for a day, and very occasionally, for 100 million years. Above that, a limestone full of shells suggests a warm, shallow sea. One place, many rooms, each new room laid gently on top of the old. Look closely and you can see that the rooms shift sideways as well as upward. The river's channel sands pinch out into muddy overbank silts. The nearshore sands fade laterally into offshore muds. A reef's limestone gives way to quieter, deeper carbonate mud. Faces, a word that can sound stern, simply means faces. Different faces of the same time, depending on where you stood. The book of one moment is not one color, but a spectrum laid side by side. To read it, we learn to follow the faces as they trade places both upward and across. We set these habits in our pocket like talismans, and then we make room for the pages that are missing. Every library has gaps. Some books were never acquired, others were borrowed and not returned. On the stone shelves, gaps appear as unconformities, boundaries where deposition stopped for a while, or where earlier pages were removed, and later writing began atop an eroded surface. Some are obvious, an angular unconformity, where tilted layers have been planed flat by long weather, and then blanketed by newer, horizontal beds, reads as an old bookshelf knocked askew, and later held by a neat, new carpentry. You can see the mismatch, and your eye rests on it, satisfied by the honesty. Other gaps are shy. A disconformity may lie between two parallel layers that look like good neighbors, yet the boundary represents seasons, centuries, millennia when the room was open to the sky, when roots probed and rain stitched tiny channels, and time basically exhaled without writing. A nonconformity places sedimentary stories atop hard, crystalline basement rock, gneiss, granite, old authors hosting new diaries. And then there are paraconformities, missing time so polite it leaves almost no surface trace, a thin line that is really an absence, a hiatus that only reveals itself when fossils below and above belong to different chapters entirely, where the gap is old and the surface lingered at the world's skin. It may carry a thin lag of pebbles, a scattering of bones, borings drilled by ancient clams into firm ground, little pockets and pits, hard ground textures that tell of exposure. We learn to run a finger along that line and feel not roughness, but the warmth of time. An unconformity is not a failure. It is the planet breathing between sentences. Once we accept that the library is made of presence and absence together, reading becomes a restful art. Relative dating, placing pages in order, becomes our first skill, a kind of shelving. We line up events by who lies atop whom, who cuts across whom, who contains pieces of whom. Then sometimes we are lucky enough to find page numbers, real numbers, not just sequence. Volcanic ash arrives in sheets that are even and sudden. When it falls, the world wears a pale veil. When it settles into lakes and seas and floodplains, it makes a thin, distinctive bookmark. Inside that ash, tiny zircon crystals cool and lock in atoms that behave like clocks. Uranium slowly, predictably becoming lead, a change that can be measured with tenderness and care. Date the zircon in the ash, and you have a stamped date for that page. Not the exact day, perhaps, but a good humble age with a little halo of uncertainty. The way we might say late summer, and know the meaning intimately. Other clocks tick in other minerals. Potassium in volcanic glass and feldspar becomes argon, a noble gas that slips into the crystal lattice and waits to be counted later by human hands. Carbon in once living things slowly loses a tiny fraction of itself. Radiocarbon fading within a span that suits recent stories. The last few tens of thousands of years, where wooden beams and seeds and bone collagen. Remember, each clock keeps its own calm tempo. Each is a metronome anchored to physics rather than weather. We learn a soft practice to bracket. A fossil bed lies between two ash layers. Each is dated with its crystalline clocks. The fossil's time is then held between, like a leaf between two clear sheets. Its age not a point but a range. Or a lava flow cuts across river sands. The lava is dated. The sands must be older. Or a lava overlies a fossil-rich soil. The lava is younger. The soil is older. We do not always know exactly when the creature fell asleep. We can say with gentle confidence that it happened after this, and before that. The humility sits well in the hand. There are global bookmarks too, not pages but watermarks that run through many books at once. The Earth's magnetic field, in its long wandering, has flipped now and then, north and south trading places like partners in a slow dance. Those flips are recorded in tiny iron-bearing minerals as they settle. They align with the field of their time, and then are fixed in rock, a tape of polarity reversals, black, white, that can be matched to the global pattern. Magnetostratigraphy. A mouthful of a word is simply barcodes in stone. Match the barcode in your canyon to the master list, and all at once the local shelf sits in the global library, dated not by ash alone, but by the planet's own compass memory. Chemostratigraphy reads the chemistry itself as script. In some eras, the carbon in the ocean changed its isotopic tune, lighter or heavier, depending on climate, life, volcanoes, the weird pulse of the world. Those changes can be traced in limestones, like the faint scent of a flower lingering at the edge of a page, spikes in sulfur, in strontium, in osmium, after meteor moments. Each an underline across bisons far apart. Match the underlines, and you align distant chapters without even touching a fossil. Fossils, of course, remain our favorite bookmarks. Certain creatures were widespread and brief. Ammonites with distinctive coils that evolved quickly, graptolites drifting in ancient seas, pollen grains whose forms announce a particular moment in plant history. Find one of these index fossils, and you have found a date stamp in a different language. Biostratigraphy is the practice of learning these languages well enough to shelve the books correctly, and to know when a stamp has been smudged by reworking. Old shells washed into younger beds, a trick the archive sometimes plays. Even the thickness of layers tells time. With soft caveats, a varved lakebed might count winters and summers like tree rings, each couplet a year that can be tallied with a steady breath patience. But rivers surge and rest in ways that write unevenly. Seas rise and fall in cycles that stack fat and thin chapters irregularly. We learn to count where counting makes sense, and to listen for mood where it does not. Time is not always a ruler. Sometimes it is a song. As we climb the shelves, names appear. Precambrian, like a long, dim vestibule. Paleozoic, with its trilobite mornings and fern afternoons. Mesozoic, in a long, warm stride with dinosaurs as incidental citizens under deeper oceans, and moving continents. Cenozoic, where mammals practice, where grasses invent windy plains, where ice learns to carve with a white knife. These are not the world's true divisions so much as ours, logical and helpful. The earth did not pause between chapters to turn a page. It flowed. We place the ribbons and say, here the tone changed. Here the cast shifted. Here the climate hummed a new key. The shelves are rarely still. Tectonics lifts and lowers them. A calm marine mud hardens to shale in the quiet dark, then is buckled when plates meet. Tilted like a picture hung by a lively child, a river sets new beds on the beveled edges, an unconformity in the open air that later becomes a line you can trace with your tongue against your teeth. Metamorphism, heat, and pressure can cook a book beyond legibility, turning its letters into new crystals, its sentences into folded bands. We accept the losses with a kind of affection. Even unreadable pages belong in the library, reminders that not every record is for us. Sometimes, the shelves almost speak. A sequence of beds inches upward from sand with ripple marks, to silt with little wavelets, to mud with burrowed threads, then back again to sand. A transgression and regression. The sea stepping in, laying a dinner cloth, then stepping back. Fossils answer the change. Marine shells above, land plants below, a brief brackish overlap between, like a conversation on a doorstep. These cycles stack like lullabies, repeated and soothing, marking beats we can feel across continents. To hold a slab and sense that rhythm is to feel the world breathing, at a scale that makes the room around you feel very safe. Bias returns to sit with us. A friend who insists on honesty. The library overrepresents certain rooms. Shorelines write quickly and often. Deep basins keep pages but fewer bodies reach them. Mountains hoard memories high where erosion is busy, then deliver them in floods of mixed confetti when they finally relax. The fossil record is thick with shells and scarce with skin, full of teeth, and rare in whispers of muscle. The time windows skew to environments that make pages lakes with fine sediments, seas with quiet floors, deltas that quilt. We will not ask for fairness from a planet whose job is not to please us. We will ask for enough, and it will give it. The craft of reading these shelves is slow and kind. A person kneels by an outcrop with a hand lens. Grain by grain, a story emerges. Rounded quartz means a long river journey. Feldspar suggests proximity to mountains. Volcanic fragments bring ash days into focus. Fossils appear. A spiral here, a bivalve there, a trace of a burrow that meanders like a daydream. A thin layer of ash is cut and tucked into a bag, not hurriedly. Later, in a lab where the lights are never harsh, the ash is dissolved until the zircons lie like tiny diamonds on black paper. A beam of ions whispers to them, asking how long they have been keeping their secret. They answer without fuss, and the page receives its number. Outside, the canyon keeps its shadows. In the afternoon, swallows practice. A hawk becomes a brief hyphen between cliffs. The shelves are unchanged by our counting. They were true before, yet something in us softens when the numbers settle into place. Your breath, which is this very minute's tide, leans against a wall that remembers seas from hundreds of millions of minutes ago. And the two coexist without argument. That feeling, a blend of tiny and held, is what the library offers. We might consider how these shelves feel in the dark. A museum keeps a long cabinet of grey drawers. On each label, a formation's name is written in an archivist's hand. Salem Limestone, Chimley Formation, Solnhofen, Green River, Berger. In the drawers, slabs are arranged like quiet letters from a correspondent who moved away long ago, but never stopped writing. Each slab carries the grammar we've learned. The ripple that points, the crossbed that leans, the thin ash ribbon, the shell-filled layer, the hiatus line like a tea stain. Each slab, too, carries the relief of being understood without being asked to be complete. We rest on a bench, and let eras pass by like a slow parade. There is no need to memorize. The hands already know the weight of a shale slice. The fingers, the texture difference between lime mud and silt. The ear has learned the sound a hammer makes when it meets a plane that will gift an open page. The eye has learned to love the imperfectly straight, the eroded surface, the tilted beds, the polite gap that holds time like air. holds the shape of a bell's last note. And we return, as always, to the smallest room, the one you inhabit. Now, the shelves here are modest. 2 books, a cup, the steady slope of a blanket from shoulder to knee. There may be a faint line of light at the curtain's edge, a little river of brightness that moves when a car passes 3 streets away. Your body is its own archive, bones growing by slow addition, then holding, hair that remembers sun in shallow chemistry, skin that keeps the day's dust and lets it go in the night. The clock nearby, if there is one, ticks like a zircon's steady confidence, and then like no clock at all because sleep listens to a different metronome. If you are still wakeful, you might imagine the canyon shelves again, but blur them until they become bands of color, soft stripes. Let them fade further until they are only the idea of layered calm. Then let that too fade, leaving you with a sense of being held by something older than worry. In the next gentle chapter, we will leave the library's tall aisles for smaller notes in the margins. Traces of a day in a life, a track pressed and sealed, a burrow lined with care. The brief comedy of a coprolite that tells Emil's story. With a smile, for now, close the book softly. The shelves will be here in the morning. The moon will write its pale bookmark across the sky and turn the page without a sound, before bodies turn to stone. Days sometimes do. At first light on a tidal flat, the wind is still deciding what to be. The mud has the satin sheen that comes just after the water slips away. Small birds write cursive in the surface, beaks pricking tiny punctuation marks as they test and taste. A crab hesitates, lifts, sets down, lifts again, inscribing a pattern of dots so regular it could be mistaken for stitching. Farther inland, where a sandbar remembers last night's moon, the ripples are crisp as corduroy, and a single set of heavier prints crosses at an angle, toes splaying slightly on the steeper faces, then disappearing where the sheet water reclaims its page. If you could pause the tide for a few extra breaths, if you could ask the air to hold its hand over the scene, this would be enough. A morning caught as a map. In the fossil record, sometimes, only sometimes, such maps are folded, put away, and years later sealed in a drawer of stone. We open those drawers softly. The pages are of walking, resting, feeding, avoiding, arriving, nesting, passing. What we meet are not bodies, but their verbs. We call them trace fossils, the fossilized evidence of behavior. The category is wide and gentle. A footprint is a trace, so is a trail, a groove, a scratch, a burrow that corkscrews, a resting oval that records a pause, a thin tube threaded with pellets, a shallow sieve where someone fed by sorting. An egg clutch is a trace, so is a nest ringed with a low lip of scraped earth. Even the stubborn humor of a coprolite, a preserve dropping, belongs here, not as a joke but as a small rounded diary of a meal. Traces do not ask you to believe in heroics. They ask you to stand where someone once stood, to feel weight and release, to imagine a temperature, a direction, a reason. At the beginning of this story, in the old seas before skeletons were common, the bottom was covered in quiet films of tiny lives, the microbial mats we've met before. Onto those mats, soft-bodied animals moved and fed. They grazed with broad bellies and patient fringes, pressed and skimmed, rested and rose. The mats responded like slightly elastic parchment. When a thin drape of new silt or a breath of chemical change stiffened the page, the pressings remain. We can hold those slabs now, low ridges that wander, paired grooves where something dragged, sudden cups where something lay. We do not know the makers intimately. We know their habits. Even that is a kind of company. Later, when shells and limbs grew plentiful, the ground below water and air filled with new habits. Burrows flourished, some are straight and vertical. Pipes punched through shifting sand to bring a room of safety down to stillness. Some are U-shaped, a gentle siphon to filter the day. Some widen and knot, braided chambers that suggest a life that both hid and dined where it hid. The walls of some burrows are lined with pellets or coated with mucus textures, now turned lithic velvet, as if the maker papered its hallway with whatever came to hand. If you follow a rock face with your fingertips, you can feel these architectures like an alphabet, thin, meandering scribbles where worms grazed across a surface. Tasting, turning away and back, thicker, branching galleries where a creature tested the boundary between safety and food, deep, clean shafts in sands laid by waves, a life staking a claim in the noisy zone between shore and sea. Whole beds are threaded by such traces, a palimpsest written by the hungry and the wary. They tell us not only who lived there, but how lively the bottom was, whether waves bullied or breezes whispered, whether oxygen was a generous host or a strict one. Above water, tracks take the lead. A track is more than a print. It is a conversation between a foot and a surface at a particular moisture, a particular firmness, a particular moment. Pressed down and the margin crumbles differently in wet than in dry. Lift and the suction pulls a lip up or leaves none. In clay the toes are crisply cut, in silt they are smudged, in sand they bulge. The same animal on the same day leaves different characters on different pages, a reminder that even footprints carry accents. A single print is a greeting. A series of them, left, right, is a voice. The pace and stride sketch, speed without a stopwatch. The angle of the foot tells of turning or caution. Display of toes of softness underfoot. The deeper sink of the heel of a pause that was longer than a step. When two sets cross and one smudges the other, we know who came after whom. When a tail drags lightly between steps, the day's mood is written in a low arc. When a slide ends in a spray of scratches, we hear a last-minute decision. Not all trackways are clear, and of course they rarely are whole. A ridge on the underside of a bed might be the positive of a print made on the surface below, an undertrack, transmitted through thin layers before being sealed. The shape is often broader, the details blurred to a hunch. We learn to hear that softer voice. Overprints confuse the story, as if several children used the same page for hopscotch. Rain may have dimpled the surface before or after, its tiny cups overlapping pads and toes like applause. Roots may have later pried apart the edges. The archivist was in a mood that day. We read accordingly. Eggs and nests carry a different sweetness. To sleep in stone beside a clutch is to be invited into a quiet, domestic hour. Many lives shared. In some ancient sands, circular scrapes with shallow rims hold dozens of eggs arranged with attention. Rounded forms that look like the beginnings of planets. The shells speak with fine textures, tiny pores that once breathed for growing bodies. In a few rare pages, the curve of a crouched adult has left a shallow impression atop the nest. Arms outstretched as if to cover. We do not intrude. We only look. The day that made those marks was not long or dramatic. It was careful. It was warm enough. Still enough. The evidence says so without saying much else. Coprolites, those small rounded diaries, deserve their moment without ridicule. They are time capsules filled with what a life found edible. Split one, and you may see fish scales winking like tiny tiles, bone splinters packed at odd angles, or plant fibers arranged in swirls. Sometimes the interior is a honeyed cream, sometimes shot through with darker flecks. Minerals often find coprolites inviting. Phosphate draws phosphate, so the package hardens early. The contents sealed. To hold one is to hold not the body, but its choices. A list of meals written in matter. There is something tender in that, and a little funny, and very human. We have a soft caution to carry. Trace fossils are named for what they look like and how they were made, not for who made them. The same kind of burrow can be fashioned by different makers in different ages. A similar track can belong to cousins or strangers, depending on the ground and the pace. Behavioral forms recur because physics and survival are old companions. In ichnology, the study of traces, names gather around the geometry of the act. Resting impressions, feeding trails, escape burrows, vertical domiciles, looping meanders. We resist the urge to assign a single author too quickly. Equifinality, a long word for many paths to the same pattern, is part of the gentle honesty we keep nearby. We can walk a small chronology without haste. In the earliest beds of abundant animal life, the seafloor changes its handwriting. Before, microbial mats smoothed and stabilized. After, burrowers churned and mixed, oxygen and mud and life interleaving in deeper, busier ways. The ground itself became more open, more aerated, more easily crisscrossed. Trace fossils thicken, diversify and dive, speaking of a world learning to dig and feed within its own pages. Through ages, suites of traces come and go with environments, Shorelines craft simple, bold verticals, and short horizontal dashes. Deeper, calmer bottoms acquire delicate, branching scripts and small glyphs that repeat like dreams. On land, as limbs learned confidence and hips learned swing, trackways lengthened and refined. In some beds, you can follow the hesitant wobble of a first foray onto mud. From water's edge, a set of alternating pads that lead to nothing but more prints, and then back again. Those trackways from the warm, busy chapters of the Mesozoic have their own rooms in the library. Broad, three-toed prints stride across tidal flats that later slept under a mountain's snow, the tips sometimes impressed with little commas of mud, moved ahead by claws. Quadrupeds place hind feet into front footprints with neat efficiency, leaving overprints that speak of economy and balance. Herds share directions, step lengths syncing the way friends do, without thinking. The long tone of a group moving together across a wet morning. In some places you can see a sudden scatter, as if a shadow moved overhead. In others, parallel lines hold for meters, as if the rhythm of the day was untroubled. The bodies are gone, the choreography remains. A favorite kind of trace is so humble that people often step over it. On the underside of a slab, little conical bumps are crowded together, their tips pointing down like stalactites caught in the act of falling upward. They are casts of tiny pits made by raindrops, striking mud. If such a rain is followed by a light, sealing sheet, a sneeze of silt from a stream, a sigh of dust from a wind, the pattern survives. To touch these is to touch a cloud's brief conversation with the ground, a weather minute kept for a geologic hour, and then there are the rest imprints, shallow ovals with skin textures pebbled on their floors, where a creature settled its belly, folded its limbs, and waited. Some show the sweep of a tail laid aside, some carry the grid of scales. The day was likely warm, the sun was likely part of the plan. A breeze might have lifted fine dust and set it down again, before a thin film of something finer arrived, and said enough. Traces do not have to be grand to be instructive. A curved groove across a surface of ripples is the path of something dragged, not by teeth perhaps, but by water, tugging at a body that still had mass. It tells of a flow direction and a sequence, first the ripples, then the drag, then the seal. A cluster of small, overlapping scrapes may be the excavation of a nest, or the frantic push of hind claws during a struggle you do not need to imagine in any detail. A broad, repeating swirl is the feeding of a fish that sifted a bottom with its mouth, and then moved one body length to try again. You can see the interval measured in emptiness. Circle, space, circle, space. If you've ever raked a garden and paused, then gone on with the same rhythm, you already know how to read it. Bias walks here too. A polite chaperone. Substrates capture certain acts and miss others. A day of leaping may leave nothing in firm sand. A day of standing still can leave a deep, perfect print in fine mud. Burrows in loose beach sands hold, because new sand pours in and helps burrows in soft lake mud slump and forget. Traces favor low oxygen bottoms, where worms have fewer rivals to blur their writing, and mats to hold outlines. High-energy shores preserve certain bold things and erase finer ones. Time averages pages together. A trail written in morning sun might be crossed and recrossed all afternoon before the sealing sheet comes. We are careful to remember how many hours can live inside one stone page. There is also the matter of depth. A print we see may not be the surface print. It may be the transmitted echo 1 or 2 layers below. The underprint is broader, like a shadow at dusk. If we mistake it for the true surface print, we might measure too great a foot, assign too grand a maker. We learn to check bedding planes, to find the companion surface to test with light raking across texture. The work is quiet. The correction is gentle. Error is part of learning to hear a soft voice in a noisy house. As for coprolites, they remind us that eating and being eaten are part of any day's business, and that the record sometimes keeps even that chapter. A folded spiral, full of ground plant matter, hints at a gut built to follow long aisles of fiber. A compact pellet, bristling with tiny bones, says something about a hunter who swallowed quickly and digested mainly the soft. There are even coprolites with scratches on their exteriors, nibbled later by small mouths seeking the phosphates. Evidence that a trace can be the beginning of another trace. Everything is connected in comfortable, practical ways. Eggshell fragments in sediments rid like confetti, but their microscopic patterns, tiny columns and pores tell of gas exchange and incubation quirks. In beds where many nests cluster, one can sense a rookery day, bodies coming and going, scents layered, calls layered, a patient rearranging of sand. Sometimes you find a spiral of small stones in a nest bowl, perhaps a decoration, perhaps an accidental ring from the scraping. Sometimes you find only the lowest inch of a rim and the vaguest hint of an oval. You imagine the rest with respect and stop before you are telling yourself a story the rock did not authorize. We might step back for a breath and ask what these pages do to the mind at night. Why are they calming? Perhaps because they are intimate without being invasive. They offer a life's adjacency rather than its anatomy. They suggest a morning without telling us how it ended. They are humble in detail and rich in inference. In that space, our own day's edges soften. We feel footprints behind us, but on sand that will soon be smoothed. We feel the curl of a rest imprint, but know the animal rose and walked on. To bring the scale home, you could think of the traces you made today, the faint oval your mug left on a table, the hollows pressed in a cushion that sprang back slowly, the trail your shoes made in dust along a sidewalk, briefly sharper where you paused to greet someone, the softness at the edge of a page where your thumb lingered. If a ceiling layer could fall over your evening now, a quiet silt of time, and keep one of these small signs, what would you choose to carry forward? Perhaps the little arc your hand made on a blanket, before it found stillness. Perhaps the way the bed learned your shoulder's shape. Those too are trace fossils in the making, even if they will not harden into stone. They matter as much for their brevity. We can end with a short walk across a field of rock. The sun is not harsh. A breeze has pages in it. On the slab beneath your shoes, there is a shallow depression that fits your palm. It is the rest of something with a ribbed belly. You think next to it, a line of three-toed steps flows past, confident and unhurried. Between them, thin worming ridges record a different, older tide. Above, a swallow draws its quick script across the sky which leaves no print, and yet you feel it. A few paces on, there is a small, round stone, no larger than a plum. When split, it smells faintly of damp, like a cellar. Inside, the past meal glints with tiny scales. You close it carefully and set it back in its place, as if tucking someone in. The day those marks were made was ordinary. The light changed. Water rose and fell. Feet sought firmness. Mouths sought food. Bodies rested and then resumed. That ordinariness is the comfort fossilization. When it touches behavior, flattens clocks into patterns, and the patterns hum with the same rhythm your own breath follows now. Let the rhythm continue. Let the room keep your weight, as if you were a gentle print in very fine mud. The archivist of water will be by later, with a thin sheet of silt for the field and a thin sheet of sleep for you. In the next chapter we'll visit the small miracles where soft parts linger, amber and ice and dark pools that hold a whispering outline. For now, the verbs of a long-ago morning are still legible, and your verbs for breathing, for settling, are enough. Some evenings the world practices stillness in unusual ways. In a forest where trunks lean like patient pillars, a tree opens a bright tear and lets golden resin slip. In a high country where wind combs grasses the color of moonlight, winter swallows a valley and sets it aside in glassy cold. In a low basin with a smell like old smoke and sun-warmed pitch, dark pools breathe very slowly, and anything that leans too close is held. In dry hollows where the air itself seems thirsty, crystals grow like quiet frost, and the smallest whisper of water is coaxed away into salt. These are rooms where time learns to pause. We have been following ordinary paths. The hush after motion, the blankets of sand and pillows of mud, the way water learns the shape of bone, the shadows that act in stone, the library of layers, the choreography of tracks and burrows. Tonight, we step into rarer chambers. They feel like side chapels in a vast cathedral. Amber, ice, tar, and salt. Each keeps memory differently. Each is a small miracle without hurry or spectacle. We go softly. First, the golden room. Resin is a tree's summer tear, A viscous kindness it spills when bark is wounded or when small invaders test its patience. It gleams when new, catching a leaf. A bit of dust, a passing ant that pauses one heartbeat too long. For a while, it is sticky, honey with a fur's breath. Then it skins, hardens, and slowly, very slowly forgets its softness. Deep in the ground, under pressure and time, resin becomes copal. And copal, if you give it more ages still, crosses an invisible threshold into amber. Polymer chains making peace with one another. Volatile bits long gone. The material now a patient, light-keeping stone. We picture a drop sliding along rough bark and swelling into a rounded lip. A gnat skims the surface and is held, its light body trapped like a comma in the text. A spider touches, then 2 legs, then all 8. Threads of web are drawn into the syrup, like fine handwriting misunderstood, and then tenderly filed away. A flake of lichen, a pollen rain, perhaps the tiniest feather barb from a bird settling above the resin says yes to each. Without debate, if more resin follows, a second bead, a third. Layers smooth the day's accidents into a small glowing bead. Later, storm or gravity sends the bead to the floor of the forest, and leaf litter folds it in. Inside amber, the world looks like it's holding its breath. Legs end in tiny claws you can count. Compound eyes are a mosaic of deep night. Air bubbles are silvered moons. Even colors sometimes linger, the way memories do. Not exactly true, and yet meaningfully themselves. Rarely, a creature bigger than an insect. Maybe a tiny lizard's toe, maybe a fragment of frog skin, perhaps the fringe of a dinosaur's feather, touches that golden pause and gives up a small hello to the future. Even bacteria can be outlined. Even the tender feet of a fly are kept. Pads and hairs and all, forms that usually vanish before noon on an ordinary day, hold their pose for millions of nights. The bias here is as clear as the amber. This room favors the small, the forest-born, the beings who live where resin flows. We do not expect a deer. We do not expect a fish. We meet spiders, wasps, beetles with their sturdy armor, mites with their hairbrush legs, springtails like punctuation sparks. We meet plant parts that drifted needles, scales, pollen, tiny flowers that look like stars fallen into a shallow sky. The forest writes its diary in amber, not the whole world. We read it with gratitude rather than complaint, and there are caveats we hold gently. Resin is not water. It is a chemistry all its own. It preserves forms in exquisite detail, but it can mingle and move, shift a leg a hair's width, soften membranes into suggestion. The thought of ancient DNA sleeping intact in amber is a lively story, but in practice genes weather quickly, their long ladders breaking into little letters. Sometimes fragments remain, phrases from which we infer, but not song. We can love the brightness without asking it to sing beyond its range. If you have ever found a small chip of amber and held it to the window, you know the feeling. Liquid light poured into a solid, the room where you sit takes on a hush like a forest after rain. Within the golden, a tiny thing might be paused midday. Time is slow enough here for sleep to find you. Now, the white room. Ice is not tender in the way resin is. It is stricter, but devoted. In places where the year is a long hush, and the ground remains below the breath of thaw, permafrost. Winter is the permanent librarian. When a body enters such a room and freezing arrives quickly, decay's busy voices are quieted. Microbes doze. Enzymes fail to turn their little keys. Water inside cells turns to glass-like structures if the cold comes in the correct tempo, or to crystals if the pause is hard. The latter can tear as they grow, and so fragility is part of the ice room's truth. Yet the macro shape remains. Hair keeps the day's wind-combed pattern, eyes cloud like early morning ponds. The trunk, a hide, a set of whiskers can cross millennia with their story still close to the surface. We picture a steppe under a pale sun. The grasses hiss softly. A young mammoth, perhaps, lies down in late season. Snow leans over the landscape, like a quieting hand. Beneath, ground that never truly softens meets a sudden drift and chooses to hold layers of ice, then silt, then more ice, seal and reseal. The cold is thorough and keeps no visiting hours. When much later, A river clips the edge of this ledger, and a tusk peeks into daylight, like a curved moon. We are looking at a day kept with unusual calm. Ice has its own biases. It is a keeper of cold country creatures, of those who wandered the high latitudes and high altitudes. It is a punctual archivist, late arrivals and near-surface rests. Fare best. Deeper time fades back into bone and then into none. The preservations are sometimes startlingly intimate. A stomach that still smells faintly sweet with meadow herbs, a coat that carries a drift of dust, a bow in a rib that reads as a healed story. Sometimes they are tender to the point of fragility. Touch and the tissue loosens, air kisses and the texture changes. The act of seeing is the first step of letting go. We think of ice not only as a preserver, but as a metronome. Over long spans it breathes, advances, retreats, exposing and reburying. Climate, the planet's long mood, decides which pages open and which close. Lately, warming has turned the librarian's key toward release, more often, and edges of permafrost offer what they have held. We meet them with care. We remember that while muscle and hair can cross ages with surprising fidelity, the letters of DNA are delicate and often arrive as confetti. We assemble what we can without promising ourselves the complete letter. Still, the White Room gifts soft wonders. The curve of a mammoth's trunk printed on a pillow of snow thousands of years after the animal slept. A pup of an Ice Age fox so intact it seems to dream. Grasses lengthwise in a mouth. A last meal turned bookmark. The quiet here is respectful. We speak softly too, now. The dark room. Ted is an old word for a complexity. Natural asphalt, bitumen, heavy with time, seeping up where the earth's broken skin lets ancient hydrocarbons breathe. In certain bisons, the seep finds daylight in shallow pools that gleam like water, but hold like a promise. A hoof tests. So struggle writes short arcs on a sticky surface, and the trap completes itself gently, but completely. Scavengers arrive and are detained by their kindness. Predators answer a call and leave their bones beside the bones of their invited meal. Feathers fall, leaves drift, insects try their luck, and fail. Each new arrival makes the trap a little more persuasive. Over decades, centuries, thousands of years, a low mound of darkened remains builds, not in tidy order, but in a loyal neighborhood. In the tar room, soft parts rarely stay as they once were. Pitch stains and saturates, but does not keep muscle at ease like ice or resin. Yet bones endure in abundance. Tinted chocolate, heavy with bitumen that has soaked into every pore, lending a weight and color that feels both solemn and tender. Joints lie astray in the record of a struggle. Ankles press into sticky floors, wings splay, and then wait. The chemistry is preservative in its own way, antimicrobial, anoxic, and the seep's lack of oxygen keeps decay at a distance. Teeth glow, enamel untroubled. Microscopic things, too, hide in the tar pollen grains. Like spiky planets, beetle fragments like folded armor, seeds with their coats intact, tiny plant fibers that once rode a breeze. The bias here is toward trap and toward place. Tar writes the diaries of a particular low spot very thoroughly. It draws predators disproportionately because distress attracts attention, and so the record sings a little higher in the carnivore register than the landscape likely did. We read this with a smile and a correction in the mind's margin. We recognize the community behind the choir. Walk through a store of tar-kept bones in your imagination. Shelves carry skulls of big cats, short-faced and long-toothed, their canines dulled by the grit of ages. Skulls of wolves whose social lives were written in trackways, and now are guessed at in the company. Their bones keep. There are sloths with their gentle curves of claw, camels with their long, sad faces, bison with horns that arc like question marks. A crow's foot, improbably crisp. The smell is faintly of summer roads, petroleum and heat, and also of dust and paper and patient classification. Outside, tar still blinks blackly in shallow pits, bubbling a slow Morse code with swallowed air. Tar's chemistry leaves puzzles for preparators. Solvents must be chosen delicately to coax bitumen away from bone without asking the bone to surrender too. But patience is part of the story's charm. In the end, the dark room returns a chorus of bones speaking at once, ages stacked, arrivals layered like voices, every specimen another part of a trap's long sentence. And then, the pale room. Salt is a geometry of thirst. In basins where evaporation outpaces supply, sablakas, dry lakes, salt pans. The last liquid evaporates and crystals grow in place, skeletons of a mineral city rising quietly from brine, halite. Rock salt cubes stack and break, repeat and heal, their faces catching light like a chessboard made of sky. Gypsum lays bladed fans, selenite growing clear as patience. In caves, breathing dry air, crystals bloom like frost that forgot to melt. Salt pulls water away from whatever lies near it. Microbes, thirsty to the point of stillness, find the room inhospitable. Where flesh would have quickened toward decay, it instead dries and keeps a close version of itself. The simplest mummification the planet knows. Skin tightens and holds a map of pores. Hair keeps its curl. The outline of a life remains, not as stone, not as ice, but as itself made lighter. In some old mines where salt was carved and carried, fallen workers, human and animal, were found centuries later with beards intact, with clothing crisp, with a tranquility to their faces that seems borrowed from the mineral around them. Salt keeps more than bodies. It holds air and water in tiny sealed pockets, fluid inclusions that are messages from the day a crystal closed, little jars of ancient atmosphere. It keeps the marks of raindrops that fell on a drying shore and were then crusted from above. It keeps even bacteria, in stasis sometimes, brought back to growth with careful coaxing after uncounted years. Though we do not ask that room to prove too much, we accept surprises with both wonder and caution. There is bias in salt's favoring of the arid and the episodic. It writes when the basin dries, when flood follows drought, when sea fingers push inland and then summer humbles them. Many pages are fragile. Halite dissolves if shown a glass of water, and a moment. The archivist here is shy in open air. To make salt's book legible, gentleness is required. Tools that never sweat, rooms that breathe slowly, hands that learn the trick of lifting without insisting. Salt carries its own scent, clean, a little metallic, like wind through a stone doorway. When you hold a cube in your palm, you feel geometry in your hand, a mineral that is the simplest direction here, in its dryness. There is a comfort. If the day has felt damp with thought, salt is a friend. These 4 rooms, golden, white, dark, pale, do not replace the ordinary library of layers. They sit alongside special collections one visits with soft shoes. They share a theme, swiftness at the start, then slowness forever. Resin must arrive quickly to hold a wing, freeze must come early to keep a whisker, pitch must invite, then cover, crystals must grow round before breaking winds can undo. After that beginning, the rest is patience, pressure, time, and privacy. Each room blocks the usual busy exchanges. Oxygen gone, microbes asleep, scavengers kept at the door. And each room whispers its own translations. Resin turns to amber, slush becomes ice, and then keeps its lattice while seasons lick and pass. Hydrocarbons thicken, then grow still, as black mirrors. Brine chooses cubes that refuse to be rushed. There are quiet chronologies here, small timelines we can hold without strain. Resin oozes, captures, layers, falls, is buried in leaf litter, is carried a meter by a root, then stopped, is buried deeper, loses volatile parts, stiffens, becomes copal, then amber, fractures and self-heals, meets a shoreline eons later in a wave's low toss, finds a beachcomber, ice, meets a body, draws heat away, holds burial, adds insulation, permafrost thickens its grip. Rivers gnaw edges, warming years visit, discovery, a cold room, a gloved hand, tar seeps, puddles, waits invites by accident, builds a mound of bone, covers its own mound, repeats, receives seeds and pollen like stamps, hardens, is quarried or curated. Salt grows in fields of light, crusts over mud, lifts casts of footprints as the underside of a cake retains the pan's pattern, dries a life into a lightweight self, dissolves easily if we ask it to, so we do not ask. Parallels with our days arrive as gentle as sleep. Amber is the pause you take when you shelter a thought in quiet and find it later, just as you left it. warm from the keeping. Ice is the way a photograph holds an afternoon. Strict but generous, so the nervous system can rest, knowing it does not need to replay it. Tar is the heavy nap you fall into when the hours finally insist. A dark that is kind, because it will release you later stronger. Salt is the way you dry tears with a sleeve and notice the trace they leave. And also the way a room, well ventilated of worry, can preserve your best shape. We keep our caveats as soft bookmarks. Extraordinary preservation can obscure ordinary bias. Amber's forest love, ice's cold latitudes, tar's trap voice, salt's arid favor. We do not let marvel lead us out of humility. We remember that in every room the original is changed. Resin colors. What it holds, ice can fracture, tar can take and darken, salt can tighten and lift. So what we read is a careful copy or a held outline or a self-made dryer. Not the morning itself. This is not loss. It is translation, and like all good translations, it is faithful enough to matter. If you're awake enough to hold a small image, imagine this. Your palm is a window. In it rests a drop of amber, no larger than a hazelnut, warm as if it remembers sunlight. Suspended inside is a tiny fly, one wing half open as if beginning a sentence. Nearby, a few grains of pollen bloom like dull stars beyond your palm. Snow hushes an open field. Somewhere there is a tusk under the day, chilled and sleeping. Far away, a dark pool blinks and traps a leaf. A crystal grows in a quiet basin, squaring itself with all the time in the world. These rooms are not asking you to choose among them. They are simply practicing stillness in different dialects. You might notice the air in your own room dry or damp, cool or gently warm. You might feel how your blanket has learned your outline, a kind resin of fabric and habit. If you breathe out and pause for a slow count, you may notice how much of the world is keeping you without your effort. The chemistry of the air, the patience of the floor, the drift of night moving like a tide, you do not have to name. In the next chapter, we'll step into larger windows, the exceptional layers where whole communities seem to pose for a rare, soft portrait. But for now, please let the small miracles keep their vigil. Amber will hold the smallest wing. Ice will keep a whisker's curve. Tar will treasure the crowded choir of bones. Salt will write geometry around silence. And you are allowed to be preserved by this moment. Not as a specimen, not as a story for later, but as a feeling. Your body settling, your thoughts drying into simple shapes. Your breath becoming the gentle clock of a very old, very kind world. Some shelves in the library of deep time do not simply hold a page, they open like windows. You step close and the glass is startlingly clear. Muscles are hinted, skin is textured, the delicate fringes of a fin or a feather's barbs glow with the certainty of being seen. Whole neighborhoods appear in one glance, hunters and drifters, burrowers and floaters, plants that breathe water and insects that borrowed the air, paused together as if a choir had taken a breath and never quite let it go. In the language of the field, these windows are called Lagerstätten, a German word that means simply storage places, though what they keep feels more like a gift than a store. Some gather many lives in one spot, a concentration that tells of abundance or of repeated gatherings. Others keep soft parts with tenderness, rare in stone, the conservation of bodies beyond bone. We don't need the labels tonight. We can think of them as exceptional archives, side rooms where time arranged for a longer holding. They begin, almost always, with an interruption, the gentle kind that ends bustle without cruelty. A blanket falls quickly, fine mud, a hush of ash, a glide of limey silt, oxygen thins to a whisper. Borrowers, those cheerful editors, do not arrive. Minerals make early promises to tissues that would otherwise hurry back to the cycle. What follows is not magic, only patient. Let's walk softly through a few rooms. Not as a tour, not as a list, but as a series of evenings. High in a mountain country where shale breaks like dark paper, the slope smells of rain and pine. The strata tilt like pages, lifted by a slow breeze. Here on beds that were once the low floor of a Cambrian sea, animals without armor, soft, inventive, improbable, lie pressed as if drawn in a child's favorite ink. There are bodies with fluting lobes and braids of gill filaments, little paddles arranged like the teeth of combs, stalked eyes that once scanned a dim water full of drifting light. A few forms seem almost whimsical at first. Spines where you didn't expect them, mouths like ringed purses, a fan of flaps along a body that seems unsure whether it swims or walks. Then the surprise softens into comprehension. Life was trying many doors, and the sea was kind enough to hold a few experiments still. In these beds, communities look complete in a way that soothes the mind. Bacteria wrote their mats across the seafloor, binding it like thin felt into that quiet. Occasional pulses of mud arrived, sealing a day's traffic in a fine, dark envelope. Bodies folded gently, eyes retained their clusters. Sometimes the faint outline of a gut lingers like a thread. Later the mountain rose, and with it the pages, and somewhere a field hammer tapped, and a slab opened like a book. Inside, an early chapter in the story of animals was legible, not as rumor, but as a conversation. Far away in space and time, the air is warm and salted with a little lime. A labyrinth of lagoons lies behind a low reef. The water is quiet enough to reflect a cloud without smearing its edges. Between islands, thin sheets of carbonate settle as evenly as dust on a windowsill. The bottom breathes slowly. Little oxygen reaches it. Burrowers are rare. Into these pans of stillness, winged lives sometimes drift. The feathered and the leathery winged, dragonflies with panes of glass for wings, delicate things that do not usually bridle stone consent to be outlined here, down to the frill at the edge of a membrane, the print of a feather, the faint suggestion of skin granules on a small reptile's foot. We think of a single feather, its shaft, its barbs, even the tiny hooks that knit neighboring barbs into a flat sheet, pressed into a limestone page, so fine it was once used for printing lithographs. We think of a light-bodied animal poised between air and ground, a day's chance bringing it to a surface that would become history. We think of a fish, tossed from a quiet channel into a pool, sinking and settling and finding that the pool's patience was nearly endless. Here, stone memorizes lightness. There is a lake ringed by forest, in a time when mammals were finding their stride, and birds stitched the air with new habits. The lake is deep enough to stratify, forming layers of water that do not mix. The bottom layer is dark and breathless. Nothing stirs it, except the slow fall of fine particles, diatoms, glass shells, clay like sifted flour, pollen and dust. When the seasons mark their cycle, couplets of light and dark accumulate like a metronome, vards that a careful finger could count and keep. Now and then, something living slips out of the everyday and lies down in that dark, a bird with a tilting head and a crop still brimmed with seeds. A back so complete its wing membrane shows at the join, a small horse with stomach politely keeping the record of a last meal, fish that turn together in one thin layer as if a storm had lowered the surface into their house. Oil-rich shells drink in these shapes and refuse to yield them to the blur of time. Feathers retain their downy halos. The brush of fur is legible. The contents of a gut can be guessed without any sharpness of detail that would unsettle the heart. The lake kept its breath, and in that held breath it also kept afternoons. Elsewhere, a chain of quiet lakes in a warm interior basin learns to write in the language of repetition. Winter lays pale layers, summer writes darker ones, fish settle into the rhythm. Schools scattered by an overturn, gulls' feathers arriving with a wind, and the lakes keep them not because their waters are harsh, but because their floors are hospitable to memory. Leaves press themselves, veins branching finely into capillaries of stone. Insect wings lie like lace. A little lizard rests exactly as if sun-warmed moments ago, the curve of its tail coiled politely beside it. Each page is a day, or a season, or a year. The thickness is not impressive. The fidelity. There are other rooms where preservation grows inside small houses of ironstone, nodules that harden around a body swiftly enough to hold impressions of softness. In low coastal plains where river and sea traded places often, sugary silt and clay sat under warm, reducing waters. There, a dropped leaf or a shrimp, a low fish or a fern frond, could be wrapped in a chemistry that favored early mineral jackets. Little concretions that split open now like eggs to reveal a creature's outline inside. Some nodules are no larger than a palm. Some need 2 arms to lift. Opened, they smell faintly of tide and old rain. Inside, the print of a jelly body is possible, which is astonishing enough to make a person press their lips together and breathe through their nose for a moment. In yet another room, volcanic ash plays archivist, arriving in fine, settling veils over lakes cradled by hills. The beds swap ash, mud, ash so that every so often, the world's own thin page number appears among the organic pages. Feathers wear their barbs like frost. Tiny dinosaurs, bird-like in posture, rest with legs tucked and tails folded. The pose of sleep we recognize even across ages. Sometimes color surprises remain in melanin's long-lasting clues, suggesting a banded tail, a dusky crown. Branches press their leaves with dignity. The feeling here is one of quiet neighborhoods interrupted not by violence but by blanketfuls of powder that closed the door softly and left. And under a grey sea that breathed little, in black shales that weather with a silvery sheen, the dead were not only covered but gilded from within, iron paired with sulfur to make tiny cubes and films of pyrite, fool's gold mapping gills, and the run of soft tissue in creatures that ordinarily leave only their hard parts. A trilobite, that would elsewhere be a shell here, shows its legs, the fine antennae that tasted the world. Starfish keep their fringe of tube feet as if reaching. The minerals chose to seat themselves early, faithful to form, and later the rock lifted its corners to let us peep. The list could stretch, but that is not our aim. Windows are better than lists. What they share matters more than their addresses. They were quiet bottoms, anoxic layers that lowered the volume on decay, fine sediments that flowed like silted breath, microbial mats that glued a floor so prints were sharpened, and bodies gently supported. Early mineral films that attended the perishable phosphate wrapping a fragile tissue, pyrite sketching, where soft once lived. They were rooms with few interruptions, burrowers barred, scavengers delayed, currents dulled. They were ordinary on ordinary days, and then, now and then, they were. These archives are honest about their preferences. They favor basins and lagoons over surf and cliff. They prefer settings that keep water still or air quiet. They often sit in places where chemistry leans one way toward carbonate, toward silica, toward iron. They select for bodies that were present there, which means they can lull us into forgetting all the lives that thrived elsewhere, on beaches full of sound, in rivers that refused to hold still, in forests far from resin, and outside the low bowls of tar. A window is not the whole house, it is enough to see the room it frames. Another soft truth arrives with them. These are often snapshots, not home movies. A layer an inch thick may hold a day's work of wind or a week's run of settling or a single event's hush. A bed, a meter thick, may collect 1,000 small quiets into one statement. We must be careful not to stitch too firm a story from a moment. The fish that lie as if they turn together might have turned together once. They might also have accumulated as a set of similar afternoons. Both readings can be kind, and we lean toward humility. Even as we hold these caveats, the relief these windows offer is real. Seeing soft parts lowers a kind of background stress in our reading. The unknown shrinks, and the known wears a gentler face. An eye's arrangement tells us something about light in the water. A gut's contents hint at who fed on whom and when. A membrane carries the map of flight and gliding, of warmth kept close, of the air's conversations with a living surface. A leaf's cuticle remembers the abundance of pores, how thirsty the air was, and how generous. Communities, brittle stars crowded like daisies, shrimp sharing a burrowed street, fishes of different shapes, layered without grinding against one another, sing harmonies that isolated bones cannot. We might pause here to notice how you feel when a pattern fills in. A day when someone finally called you back, a puzzle piece pressed, and the negative space stopped shouting. The windows in stone do that for the mind. They make the big room of time feel furnished. Bias visits again, not as a scold but as a reminder with a hand on our shoulder. Exceptional archives are exceptional, because the conditions are rare. They tilt our sense of what is normal. The Cambrian Sea, with its soft-bodied fullness, is not every Cambrian sea. The warm lagoons are not every shore. The lakes that keep feathers are not every lake. We correct gently, with pencil. We love them without letting them speak for anywhere they were not. You might ask, softly, how such rooms become known at all. Often it is ordinary work that leads there, mapping a formation as it paces across a valley, splitting promising beds not in hope of magic, but because mudstone at a certain level has been generous before. Sometimes it is happenstance. A quarry face for building stone coughs up a wing. A road cut reads like a chapter. A farmer's field delivers nodules that, opened by curiosity, reveal more than ironstone. And then, as news moves, care arrives. Hands that know which tools to leave at the door. Lights that do not bake. Glues that breathe. Papers that cradle instead of scratch. The windows must be cleaned without smearing. The room must be entered without rearranging it. There is one more kindness these archives teach. The scale of the extraordinary can be small. A cricket singing is a data point for a summer. The imprint of a jelly is a data point for a sea. A feather's after feather, downy, unassuming, gives more climate than a mountain sometimes. In stone as in life, the whispers can carry more information than the shouts. You may notice, as you listen, that your own room has grown calmer. The windows are probably dark now. The furniture is the same. And yet something about thinking of still waters and thin pages, of ash that fell quietly and kept what it covered, has softened the edges of attention. Exceptional preservation is, at heart, about how little you have to do when the world does the holding for you. If it helps, borrow a small image before we leave this chapter. Imagine a slab the size of your notebook. On it, a fish, no longer than your hand, lies with its fins splayed like stars, a faint shadow of scales catching the light. To one side, a leaf, with its midrib and delicate tributaries, all the way to the margin, where tiny teeth repeat. Above, the ghost of a water bug sits as if ready to scull away. Behind them all, a surface so fine it looks like paper. Somewhere beyond the quarry, where this slab came from, night frogs call. You place your palm near the fossils, not on them, and the stone's cool moves toward your skin. All of it is very quiet. All of it feels like permission. In the next gentle chapter, we'll leave the windows for the pathway a fossil takes to reach light boots in a field. A brush's whisper, a jacket of plaster, the lab's careful air, the long kindness of curation that lets a specimen rest while being seen. But before we go, let the exceptional do its work, which is not to dazzle, but to reassure. Sometimes the world writes in bold ink, sometimes it underlines, and sometimes, with luck and patience, it keeps a whole afternoon intact, so that we, much later and very small, can read it, feel the pace slow inside us, and close our eyes without missing anything at all. At first light, the Badlands are a book left open overnight. Ridges lie like folded pages. A single magpie writes a dark line across the pale margin of sky. Somewhere below a weathered slope, a small shard of bone has lifted itself toward morning. No bigger than a fingernail, a triangle, the color of tea. It could be anything. It could be nothing. The wind is kind enough not to decide. Boots move without hurry. Canvas whispers. A palm hovers and does not touch. The shard is not the point. Not yet. The place is the point. The thin bed it peeks from. The layer above that winks with mica. The layer below that breaks like chocolate. The angle of its tilt. The way the gullies converge as if the land were pointing with several quiet fingers at once. Notes are made with a pencil that has already learned the day's brightness. The coordinates, the line of the ridge, the color of the bed in terms the team understands. The shard is measured, photographed, given a small number in a small book. Only then does the edge of a brush meet dust, as softly as a moth. We have arrived at the long kindness, the pathway a fossil takes from field to light, from the privacy of stone to the shared hush of a case, or a page or a screen. It is not a rescue so much as a careful relocation. If the creature has been resting for millions of years, an extra season, an extra year is no insult. Urgency does not live here. Conversation does. The first conversation is with the land itself. We speak its names correctly. We admit, gently, that permission matters. Some places are open with rules that are clear. Some are held in stewardship by communities whose stories braid this ground into memory and lore. Some are protected, so the book can remain open only to the wind. The day's work begins only when the place says yes. If the place says no, the day becomes a walk, not a dig, and that is lovely in its own way. When the land agrees, The second conversation is with context. The older library around the small shard, a fossil without its page, is a phrase torn from a paragraph. So we listen for the paragraph. Measure the thickness of beds. Record the direction of ripples frozen in sandstone. Kneel to read a mudcrack's geometry. Trace a thin ash line with a fingertip like a gold thread that will someday give a date. A sketch grows in the notebook. Ridge, gully, the bed's gentle dip. A small triangle marking the shard's first hello. Photographs catch angles, close-ups and the larger setting where a person can recognize the very spot if they return. The shard remains where it is while the place around it becomes legible. Only later, when the light turns warmer and the air smells faintly of sage and sun-warmed dust, does excavation begin. A circle is cleared. Not large, not small, just enough room for a story to stand up in. The tools are modest. Brushes with bristles, soft enough to comfort. Small trowels that would not shame a gardener. Dental picks with edges like stern whispers. A hand lens that enlarges a universe without raising its voice. Each stroke removes, reveals, pauses, records. A turtle shell emerges in pieces like petals. A vertebra winks with its ring. A limb bone announces itself with the gentle curve of a shaft. Nothing is forced. If the stone resists, the hand listens harder. The bones, when they appear, are not lifted like treasure. They are stabilized where they lie. Tiny drops of reversible consolidant breathed into cracks, so fine you could mistake them for shadows. A thin tissue of gauze, laid like a cloud across a fragile surface. A smile exchanged between field partners, because something beautiful is happening, and they both can feel it. When the day leans toward evening, the exposed shapes are covered again. Paper, foil, a blanket of soil, because the cool air and the night's dew can be unkind. Sleep is part of the method. The fossil has been waiting. It can wait through another dark. In the morning, the work resumes, circling outward and downward, until the block of stone that holds the bones is cradled on all sides by trenches and held below by a pedestal. Measurements are taken again. The pedestal is cut with care, and the block lowered, sometimes by hands alone, sometimes by a tripod and webbing, sometimes in larger cases by a gentle lift that might involve a rope line to a patient animal, or the careful hum of a machine. But before any movement, the block receives a jacket, like a winter coat. Strips of burlap dipped in wet plaster are laid, one after the other, across the stone skin, crossing like bandages with a memory for embrace. The plaster warms slightly as it cures, the cozy heat of transformation, and then cools into a shell that keeps the contents from flexing under their own surprise at being asked to travel. A label is written in pencil on the jacket, the field number, the bed, the date, the initials of those who sat cross-legged beside it, breathing the same dust for days. A small arrow marks north, because even a rock likes to know its orientation. The jacket is undercut, separated from the earth that has held it for so long. In that moment, there is sometimes a quiet murmur, gratitude given to a slope that allowed to weather that tempered, to chance that stacked its coins in favor of this small conversation. The block moves into the shade of a tarp, onto a sled, into the bed of a truck that knows how to drive slowly. Somewhere, a notebook receives another line. On the road, 4 turn 10 p.m., light wind, temperature kind. Transport is often the least glamorous and the most suspenseful part of the journey. Rucks ask questions. A sudden rain tests a plan. The road out is longer than the road in, but the plaster holds and the memory of measurements holds. And an evening later, the jackets shiver briefly as they pass from outdoor air into the settled cool of a lab. Doors open. People who are not in the field lean in with a kind of familial welcome. The jacket is set on a table that does not shake. The lights over that table are bright, but not hot. The label is copied into a ledger, not because the first copy is untrustworthy, but because 2 is kinder than 1, when time has a habit of misplacing things. Preparation is a different sort of landscape, quieter, more precise, no less patient. Air vibrates softly. A stereo microscope waits with its twin circles of light. On a tray at the elbow are instruments that would not surprise a jeweler, pin vices holding needles sharpened to a crescent, microchisels, with tips like promises, tiny pneumatic scribes that tap stone to dust in hundreds of kisses per second. and wands that exhale baking soda grit to polish away what does not belong. Bottles hold clear adhesives made to be reversible, numbers fading on a label over years, but the bond it makes, always willing to let go. If a future hand asks politely, everything here is meant to keep choices open. The fossil will outlive all of us. We keep the door unlocked. A preparator begins where the field left off, often with the map drawn on the jacket itself. A window is cut into plaster and folded back. The stone within smells faintly of rain. Under magnification, a surface that looked smooth becomes a landscape of facets and pits, and bone declares itself with a slightly different language, a gloss, a pattern of vascular channels, a color that is not the stone. The work is slow and deeply social. The preparator listens to the specimen. The specimen tells the preparator what it will tolerate today. Even here, choices are never final. Some parts remain in their matrix because the stone provides better support than any glue could. Some are revealed only enough to understand their curves. The negative space is respected. The object's need to rest is larger than our desire to fill a display. Sometimes chemistry offers a hand acid baths that nibble away limestone grain by grain to free a shell, a tooth, a delicate spine that would have shattered under a tool. This too is supervised with a tenderness that borders on affection. If the fossil sighs, we hear it. Alongside traditional tools, light and invisible eyes join the work. Photogrammetry, many photographs from many angles stitched by thought, builds a three-dimensional whisper of the specimen and its posture in the rock. CT scans ask stone to become transparent, so the bones inside can be understood before a single grain is lifted. Micro-CT travels into structure, growth rings, marrow spaces, a tiny healed fracture that tells a story of injury and time. Sometimes these scans create models that can be printed in harmless plastic for handling, for classroom laughter and wonder, while the real fossil continues to do what it has long done: rest. In the midst of this, labels multiply. In the best sense, the field number becomes an accession number, which becomes catalogue entries written in a language of calm precision. Formation, member, bed, locality, collector, date, taxon, if known, and importantly, unknown, no pressure to name before the fossil is ready to be called. A number is inked in a tiny oval of archival paint on the bone itself, in a place that can be found later without searching. The number is the fossil's compass. With it, anyone can find the specimen's story back through the lab, the field, and into its shelf in time. Curation is less visible than discovery, and more enduring. A room with shelves that do not sag, cabinets that close without a clank, their seals forgiving, temperature that changes so slowly you cannot feel it unless you live there, humidity that chooses an average and holds it, padding that remembers shapes without insisting, pest traps that are checked, quietly as a kind of housekeeping. A specimen enters this room not as a trophy but as a resident, with a drawer that is a little apartment, foam bed, custom cutouts, a small envelope for fragments that might part ways, a card describing where everything sits. The lights are low most days. The loudest sounds are paper and gentle talk. Ethics live here too, in the filing, in the doors that open, in the habit of writing down where every piece came from, and where it may go. Specimens collected with permission, under terms that honor land and law, agreements that share knowledge and credit with the people whose home ground held the memory. In the first place, a humility about what belongs on a public floor and what belongs in a drawer, with a lock, an awareness that scarcity can tempt, and that the temptation is eased by making data generous. Images shared, measurements published, scans placed where any curious mind can see them. We remember that provenance is a soft word for a strong idea, the story of how something came to be, where it is. We protect that story as if it were part of the fossil, because some fossils go to display. The journey continues, not toward spectacle, but toward a second kind of rest, being seen without being handled. Mounts are made that carry weight into metal and foam rather than into ancient bone. The pose is chosen not for drama but for truth and comfort. A spine that is not overarched, limbs that do not strain to the limit of their fossil joints. A balance that a living animal would recognize. Light meets bone with respect. Filters calm the harsh parts of the spectrum. A small sign does the work of many words. Children press their noses to glass, and leaves soft evaporating ovals that are themselves a sort of trace fossil, a morning's astonishment, briefly archived. Others remain in the research rooms. They are visited by quiet people with calipers and notebooks, with questions that are patient and answers that are more patient still. Some days the fossil reveals nothing new, and that is fine. Not every conversation needs a conclusion. Some days a new angle of light shows a suture in a skull that had been mistaken for a crack. Some days the footprint from the field turns out to be a resting trace, and the story of a slow afternoon replaces the story of a hurried crossing. Corrections, too, are part of curation's kindness. We borrow a few vignettes to ease the mind into this cadence. A small team climbs a chalk cliff by a path that has never agreed to be a proper path. At the base, the sea practices its eternal habit of editing. High on the wall, the trace of a fin tells of layers within layers. The team measures, listens, decides to let winter pass before the attempt. Months later, in softness of spring, the jacket is made. The block lowered to a boat that does not love heavy cargo but accepts it graciously. A year after that, in a lab, a county away, a preparator under a microscope meets the fine ribs in a fish's skull roof and smiles because the pattern is like an old friend. In a desert basin, a sandstorm steals a day and gives the gift of a clean surface across which new fragments gleam like constellations. The team maps, collect only what is loose, covers what is not, and returns when the wind has forgotten its rough mood. In the lab, the loose pieces are puzzled back into a curve, and the curve into an arc, and the arc into a jaw that, once copied in plaster, will teach 10 classrooms how teeth erupt in a line older than names. In a museum's quiet, a volunteer retired from work that never involved bone or rock arrives every Wednesday at 10 and spends 2 hours removing a hair's breadth of stone from a plate of small fish. The rhythm is meditative. A decade later, the plate is ready. The volunteer's initials are in the catalogue next to preparation. The fish are in a drawer, their mouths open as if they were surprised and amused in equal measure. Through all of this, reversibility hums like a refrain. Adhesives that can be undone, jackets that can be opened without ripping history, labels that are duplicated, data that lives in more than one drawer, more than one server, more than one mind. We work as if someday someone will need to read the book differently, and they will. You might wonder, because the mind loves to measure, how long this journey takes. The answer is gentle. As long as it deserves. A week in the field, then months in a lab, an afternoon of discovery, then a year of careful preparation, a fast walk with a GPS, then a slow decade behind a glass where children grow taller as they return. Timescales shift like lenses. A bone that took 100 million years to become itself will accept a little more patience. We keep repeating our caveats because they make the calm possible. Not everything should be collected. Some fossils are best left sleeping where they lie, too fragile, too entwined with other stories, too likely to lose more than they would gain by move. When collecting happens, it is for a reason beyond possession, to answer a question, to teach, to protect from a slope that will not last another winter. Trade comes to the door and is met with care. Some things that move through markets carry their context severed, and a specimen without its story cannot be fully welcomed into the library. Partnerships with those who live where we dig make the work honest. Credit runs alongside care. And then, the best part. Light without noise. A case in a quiet hall. A slab turned to just the right angle on a foam cradle. A photograph in a book. A public data set that glows on a screen. The fossil has moved from a silence under layers to a silence among people. The new silence is warmer. There is background hum, footsteps, a murmur of curiosity, a low tide of comprehension arriving in waves. The fossil does not mind. It knows how to wait. We might end the day where we began, at the shard on the slope. It will not always be a jaw, a fern, a trackway worth jackets, and a truck bed. Sometimes it will be just that, a shard, recorded and returned to its small sunlit nest, because the page said not yet, or not this one, or let the rain decide. That, too, is professional kindness. And sleep's cousin. The world keeps more than we can ever move. We remember what we saw, and the seeing is enough. You can feel the same rhythm at the edge of your own night. A thought appears at the surface like a shard. You notice it. You write a line or two in the notebook of the mind. You cover it again with breath, and promise to return with better light. Tomorrow has its jackets, and its brushes. Tonight has its cool room, its even shelves, its careful labels. Here is a shoulder easing. Here is the spine finding a soft curve. Here are eyelids lowering like a warm plaster settling into place. From field to light is a human-sized arc drawn over a geologic line. Along it are small acts of respect, the brush that whispers rather than scrapes, the pencil that writes unknown with pride, the glue that can be persuaded to let go, the cabinet that closes softly. Somewhere a fossil lies again, newly supported, newly numbered, newly able to rest, while being seen. Somewhere else, a person stands in front of that quiet thing, breathes a little slower, and feels the old agreement that memory and patience are kin. The magpie skims the ridge once more. The sky has traded its early tea color for something clear. In a lab, a jacket cools. In a drawer, a label dries. In a hall, a child leans on glass and leaves an evaporating circle that would make a fine trace if only the case were a page. The book is still open, the page is still turning, and you are welcome to close your eyes now, knowing that what the earth meant to keep will be kept, and that sometimes our hands are invited to help, very gently with the keeping. Some letters arrive with the edges already worn. They take a long time to cross the distance. Miles of silt, centuries of pressure, the occasional fold and refold by earthquakes that rearrange the envelope. When we finally open them on a lab bench, under a sky tilted by cliffs, in the steady light of a museum afternoon, the pages are softened at the corners, the ink a little faint, the handwriting unfamiliar but patient. We read anyway, slowly, with a pencil in hand rather than a pen, making notes in the margins that say perhaps this, perhaps that. Fossils, in this quiet way, are weathered letters from places we cannot visit, and though the words are incomplete, the tone is often clear. It says, here is what the water felt like. Here is what the air tasted like. Here is who ate whom, and who hid, and who left at dusk. It says, here a fire moved through. Here the sea grew tired and stepped back. Here for a time a swarm of tiny shells toiled and made a chalky rain. We sit with one such letter now. It is the tooth of a grazing animal, enamel worn along a long afternoon. To the eye it is grey, simple. To the hand it is heavier than you expect. The weight a bone learns after living in rock. Yet inside, the tooth keeps a temperature diary written in chemistry. The oxygen in its enamel carries a subtle ratio, a whisper about the water the animal drank, and how warm or cool that water tended to be. The carbon tells a complementary tale. Grasses of one kind leave a slightly different signature than leaves of another. From a single tooth, read carefully and humbly. You might sketch a landscape, open, wind-bent, with more grass than shade, or patchy, with gallery forests leaning over rivers, and a mix of foods on the menu. Not certainty, never that, but a leaning in one direction. Another letter is a shell no bigger than a lentil, lifted from a dark ocean bed of long ago. Foraminifera, patient builders of microscopic homes, write with chalk and keep a record in their walls. The ratio of magnesium to calcium hints at the warmth of the water in which they grew. The oxygen within tells of ice waxing and waning far away. A handful of these shells, sorted and counted and measured, becomes a soft graph of ancient temperatures, a tide of climate rising and falling in beats, slow enough to make your shoulders drop as you listen. Leaves write too. Pick up a fossil leaf and look at its edge. Smooth margins, in many places and times, favor warmer climates. Toothed margins, tiny serrations, often lean toward cooler air. It's not an unbreakable rule, but it has been a faithful friend. The veins inside, their branching, the density of their roadways, hint at how fast the plant moved water, how generous or tight-fisted the atmosphere was. The tiny pores, stomata once opened and closed with light, and their density across the leaf surface can in some plants reflect the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. Against a background of caveats, a leaf becomes a letter that says the air was easy to breathe, or a little thin. The season's length would have pleased a cicada or made it quiet. Bones carry seasons the way wood carries rings. In a cross-section, a limb bone can show bands of growth and rest, wide, during times of plenty, narrow when the world asked for frugality. Pauses may mark winters, droughts, or just the rhythm of a life that saved energy when water was shy. In a jaw, teeth erupted in sequence. Enamel accreted like layers of varnish. Some bands record stress, a migration that was longer than usual, a lean year, a pregnancy's subtle accounting. Read with care. The bands turn a skeleton into a calendar thick with penciled notes. Rocks themselves are letters with generous margins. A thin clay layer tucked between limestones carries a surprise. A dusting of elements rare on Earth's surface, common in space. Iridium appears in a whisper at the same thin page around the planet. And shaken grains, quartz shocked by a sudden unimaginable pressure, lie like glitter in the ash. Spherules, tiny melted drops, cool and fall into still water, and later into the eye of a graduate student who splits a core and pauses. The page does not shout, but it says enough. On a single difficult day near the end of a long age, something struck, and the world learned a new word for a while. Above that page, shells change, forests change. The presence of teeth of a certain kind disappears. Small things with feathers and curiosity move into empty rooms. Recovery writes itself slowly in sediments and in time. Elsewhere, the letter is darker. A black shale smells faintly of old sea and holds more carbon than mineral. Within it, are pyrite-lined outlines of bodies that rarely submit to stone gills, frills, soft bellies, eyes outlined as if sketched with a metallic pencil. The chemistry says the water was breathless at the bottom. The fauna says the surface was lively and careless. It let its dead settle into a place where nothing rearranged them quickly. Above and below, the iron and sulfur ebb and swell. When the swell is global, 1,000 far-flung basins nod in synchrony. We call it anoxia, but the letter says, the ocean learned to nap too deeply for a while. Sometimes the letters speak of fire. A thin band in a paler bed holds tiny pieces of charcoal, little mirrors of former twigs and grass. Spores darken in abundance, the signature of ferns that arrive early after a burn. The horizon above shows seedlings returning. If there are flowers in the community, their pollen changes composition for a time. Open ground, pioneers with bright faces. Fire is not always a monster in letters. It is often a part of the grammar, a clause that repeats with a rhythm, and rarely breaks the sentence. Other layers carry soot from something larger, the brief, planet-wide haze, after an impact or a flood basalt's long exhale. The letter won't force the story, but it lets us draw the outline and shade it just enough. There are letters about hunger, coprolites, examined kindly, disclose diets without judgment. Inside are ratios, bone to scale, seed to fiber, the occasional surprise shell fragments in a predator's gut, perhaps scavenged rather than hunted, stable isotopes within the droppings. Ask and answer. Was this animal a browser in shade or a grazer on open plain? Did it drink from the river often or sip rarely, and far from the source? A single pellet adds to a paragraph already forming from teeth and trackways, and plant remains. The hunger of a day becomes a sentence of a community. Trace fossils write about fear and routine in equal measure. Burrows concentrated in one layer speak of a comfortable bottom, a place worth investing in. Burrows that stop abruptly at a horizon that also carries a lot of dead shells speak of a bad afternoon. Trackways that all veer at a point on a tidal flat suggest a discouraging shadow passed overhead. Their width and depth say whether the ground was wet, whether the animal paused. Nothing in such letters is conclusive, but everything is indicative, and the accumulation of indications is how we rid a life that does not answer back. We keep reminding ourselves, the archive is biased. We have said it in every chapter, softly but steadily. The letters that reach us are from the quiet rooms, the still beds, the kind deltas, the lakes with their long patience, the ash that fell like a lullaby, the tar that held, the salt that dried, the ice that kept mountaintops a poor pen pal. Rainforests write only in rare amber, and the occasional peat that learned to be coal. Deep ocean plains write, but their letters are buried under more letters than we can yet lift. We remember and adjust. We never allow a thin sheaf to pretend it is the whole correspondent. We also remember that time, smudges. A creature long absent can be reworked into a younger sand. A shell older than its neighbors can be weathered from one layer and sent tumbling into another. A page can carry quotations from many years. We learn to recognize the typography of mixing. Sharp, unworn fragments likely died where they lie. Rounded, abraded ones traveled and then rested. The way a thought rolls for a while before it stops. Time averaging is not deception. It is a composite portrait. We label it so, smile, and proceed. The community of readers matters too. In the early days, people thrilled to see big bones and named them enthusiastically. Later, with more pages in hand, the community learned to ask quieter questions. Cladistics grouping by shared, derived characters grew out of patience with superficial resemblance. A ring of tiny bones in a jaw might mean more than the jaw's length. The way ankle bones fit could sort whole lineages. Characters are coded, trees proposed, and then tested against the rock's own order. Does the sequence of fossils match the branches we've drawn? Ghost lineages, implied presences in time when bodies have not yet been found. Whisper, be careful, your tree suggests we should be here. Perhaps we are, but still sleeping in hills you have not yet walked. Molecular clocks hum in a different register. Rates of change in living DNA, calibrated by fossil dates like small brass plaques on a wall. They suggest divergences before bones are abundant, or after the bones go quiet. Where these clocks disagree with rocks, discussion becomes a long tea shared by many minds. The excitement is not in winning, but in refining the next question. We may favor the stone's letter here, the molecule's letter there. We pencil in a range. Sleep is easier when ranges are allowed. Extinctions are chapters where the letters lean into one another, and the pencil slows between words. Some are background, a steady turnover like breathing. Species appear, flourish briefly on the page, then give way. Others are punctuation marks you can feel with your fingertip. The biggest marks arrived with multiple voices speaking at once. Rocks that tell of flood basalts, opening and pouring a dark, hot syllable into the air for 1,000,000 years. Clays that hold metal from space. Fossils that vanish across a boundary, as if a pattern had been erased and replaced with a new one. The causes are rarely singular. A door slams, but only after a window stuck half open in the storm for a while. After the marks, recovery writes slowly. There is the coal gap, after an especially hard time when peat-forming forests were absent, suggesting a pause in swampy resilience. There is the reef gap, when builders of ocean castles took longer than usual to return. There is the Lilliput effect. Organisms running small for a time, an economy of scale, adopted by those who survive early and set the stage. Then, often, there is burst and bloom, the radiations where after quiet, the letters fill with new names, new forms, unfamiliar joints and jaws, and ways of walking. The record of life is not a march but a meadow after rain. Bare soil, then shoots, then diversity in a riot that still obeys rules of light and space and time. We mark other long arcs that are less dramatic but no less telling. Shells grow thicker in some ages when predators perfect crushing tools. Plants thicken their defenses as herbivores lengthen their reach. The Mesozoic seas become busier with arms races. The land learns grass, and then teeth adjust to the grit of silica. Trends are not commandments. They are the faint slope of a hillside you only notice when you pause and drop a pebble and watch the direction it chooses. Even the distribution of letters in drawers has its own bias. The pull of the recent is a librarian's quirk. More young fossils have been collected than old, because they are closer to the surface, and to us, because our eyes and roads and maps happen to land on younger shelves more often. We correct for this, in our minds, and with our methods. We sample, we rarefy, we share. An awareness of our own footprints becomes another note in the margin. This many people walked here, at this time, looking for these things. Future readers will be kinder if we are transparent. Sometimes letters contradict. A leaf suggests warmth. An oxygen ratio suggests a cool current. Shells imply a shallower shore. Trace fossils prefer a deeper, calmer bed. The relief is not in deciding which is right, but in allowing the place to be complicated. Coasts are messy. A warm summer and a cold upwelling can coexist. A single storm can deposit a layer that confuses the eye and thrills the patient. We learn to love the places that refuse to be reduced. They feel, after all, like us. There are playful letters too. The A bone with a healed fracture speaks of a life that limped for a while and did not die immediately for it. Perhaps because a herd allowed a laggard, perhaps because the body is generous with healing, perhaps because luck is not always a stranger. The tooth wear of a very old animal says it lived long enough to chew carefully, or to accept softer food from a partner. We infer with care. Pathologies, bone that grew oddly, joints that fused, are not monsters' marks, but biographies written in collagen and mineral. They ask us to think of individuals, not only species. If you lift your eyes from the drawer now, the room looks different. Cabinets become mailboxes. Each label is an address. Each address is a time. You imagine hands writing letters to you across epochs. A fern leaf, scribbling from a warm swamp. A trilobite, rubbing its inked belly on a mat of microbes. A tiny mammal stamping its envelope with a curved tooth to say, "I liked seeds." The space grows cozy. The noise outside the hall, footsteps, gentle talk. The hum of a light becomes a distant river. Your breath lengthens without instruction. We can slip a simple chronology into the quiet. First, the bodies. They form, they live, they leave traces. They fall asleep in places that favor memory. Then, the stones. They accept the bodies, write around them, make rooms, turn soft pages into hard covers. Then, the letters. They weather, eroded into daylight, are found, are read with varying levels of insight. Our reading changes with time. A 19th century letter was opened with romance. A 20th century letter with exclamation points around dates and definitions. A 21st century letter with soft handling and a humility that is neither performance nor fatigue, but a learned kindness. This is enough, and if it is not, we will return later with a different light. You may feel the last chapters echoing here, the blankets of sand, the pillows of mud, the way water learned the shape of bone, the shadows in stone, the libraries of layers, the traces of days, the golden room of amber, the ice room, the dark room, the pale room, the windows where soft bodies were kept, the patient hands that brought a fossil to light. All of that was the making of the letters. This chapter is the reading aloud, very softly, to a friend who is falling asleep. What do the letters tell us? Finally, that life is inventive under constraints, that climate is a long tone, that sometimes changes key on a single day, but more often sulks and brightens in seasons we can measure in rot. That extinction is part of the grammar, not the end of the story. That recovery hums in simple forms first and then practices ornament. That communities are made of partnerships more than of contest, that the earth has moods, wet and dry, warm and chill, oxygen rich and oxygen poor, and life, our own included, is a great reader of moods and a quick study. That chance, ever present, leaves fingerprints on every page, and that absence is not empty. The gaps in the letter are also information. Where a word is missing, we learn what the wind favored that day. We sense what in a body tends to return to soil more readily. We interpret the lack of a type of shell, not necessarily as the absence of its maker, but as a change in water's gentle chemistry. The blank space is not a failure. It's an invitation to imagine responsibly. If you are still awake, a last small image, a river at dusk, after a dry summer, writes sand into little ribs. On the inside of a bend, a feather lays itself down. A thin sheet of silt arrives with a late cloudburst and tucks the feather in. The feather does not know this is the beginning of a letter. It only rests. Years fold into one another. The river moves away, the page presses. Stone takes the feather's handwriting and keeps it. Much later, long after our names are notes in other people's books, the slab opens. In a room with kind light, someone traces the outline without touching. They read the letter aloud. A bird rested here. The air was warm enough for insects. The water carried only a little silt that day. There was a pause between storms. And then, with a small smile, they write in pencil, perhaps, "The earth is good at keeping what it loves. The rest it returns to the cycle, which is also a kind of love. You are, tonight, free to do the same. Keep a few details, the cool of the sheet against your leg, the sound your house makes when it remembers to settle, the way your breath finds a low, steady rhythm and stays. Let the rest return. If a thought remains, write it lightly in your mind's margin, with a word like maybe beside it. You can always come back to the letter in the morning, and read further lines. Beyond the window, layers form in places no one is watching. Rivers let go of grains. Lakes stack their seasons. Leaves decide whether to keep their teeth or not. Small shells practice making homes that double as diaries. Somewhere, a tooth falls from a jaw onto a path it did not plan to take, and chemistry begins to write. Somewhere else, a child holds a spiral on a beach and feels how memory can be gentle and heavy at once. Weathered letters, all of them, enough to guide us. Soft enough to let us sleep. The last heartbeat of a day has already passed. The archivist river is whispering. Your own shelves, bones and breath, and the steady kindness of a room. Are ready. Close your eyes and let the reading continue without you for a while. Night hangs easily. Tonight. A soft, dark fabric over streets that glitter like quiet rivers, over fields that hold their frost like lace, over coasts where the tide breathes in and out, as if rehearsing a long, unhurried story. We've been walking among old rooms, mud pillows, sand blankets, bones learning the patience of minerals, shadows in stone, tidy shelves of time, the verbs of tracks and burrows, small miracles in amber, ice, tar and salt, windows where whole afternoons remain, and the careful kindness that lifts a resting fossil into light. We have read weathered letters with a pencil in the margin that says perhaps, perhaps, and now, with the house calm and the hour lenient, another question comes to sit at the foot of the bed like a friendly cat. What will last of us? Not only of you and me as individual bodies, our chances of stone are slim, and that is perfectly fine, but of our moment, our habits, our restless making. If some distant reader were to open the book, where our page lies, what would their fingers trace? What tone would they hear in the quiet between the words? We ask softly, we answer softly. The future is always an uncertain shoreline, and we are happier speaking in possibilities than pronouncements. Perhaps the page begins with texture. A river meets a city and learns a new grammar. Sand still settles, silt still writes, but woven into the grains are things the older pages did not know. Angular bits of ground glass, pale threads from clothes, beads of polymer small as dust, and stubborn as seeds, ash that learned its chemistry in furnaces, and a glitter of metals that rarely travel alone. On coasts where driftwood once gathered after storms, there are now stones fused with plastic and sand, pebbles that feel like rock, but carry the sheen of something made in a bright room, with humming lights. Someone has coined a name for them already. The name doesn't matter here. The idea is simple. Materials we invented are learning to join the slow ceremonies of sediment. And then there is the grey we pour. Concrete remembers forms, bridges, piers, long low dams, and when those forms fall, they crumble into a rubble that can sleep beneath fresh layers like reefs made of our intentions. In reservoirs, fine clays settle quietly behind walls we built, making stacks of seasons that are distinctly ours, grains that carry a whisper of smelted ores, a bright pulse of soot when many fires were burned, a pause where a drought asked more slowly for what water could deliver. Downstream, the channels tell of new rhythms, some starved of sand they once expected, some burdened with loads they do not yet know how to carry. In the shelves of deep time, these changes may read like a sudden shift in handwriting. A narrow bed where it used to be wide, a wider bed where it used to be narrow, a fast scrawl between two patient paragraphs. We have written with metals in extravagant ink. Aluminum, light as promise and rarely found in pure form in older rocks, now travels abundantly in fill and foil, in frames and cans. Copper traces our networks, steel rusts broadly, its oxides color small soils, glass breaks, and learns the tumbling patience of beach pebbles. All of these folded into deltas, pushed by storms across low shelves, sift into future shells and sandstones, as small declarations that someone once favored straight lines and bright evenings. Bones. Yes, bones are part of the letter too, but not necessarily ours. There is a kind of chicken now, whose body tells a short, vivid story, grown in a brisk partnership with people. Its bones are numerous, distributed, varied in a way that suggests a single widespread choice. If these make it into the layered book in any number, they may read as the echo of a single species that preferred us as company. a chorus of little arcs and joints, sealed into lake muds and floodplains. Domestic grazers leave teeth and hooves where wild herds once spread theirs thinly. Urban scavengers leave footprints, even where bedrock seems far from dirt, their steps recorded in thin films of dust and city rain. There are even page numbers we might accidentally provide. When we learnt the power in splitting atoms, we added small, distinctive isotopes to air and ocean and soil signals that for a time travelled everywhere at once. If future readers find our thin ash-like layers, those signatures could act like bookmarks. Here they might say, is mid-century above, a long breath below, an earlier tune. Other numbers have quieter ink. The ratios of carbon that hint at our fondness for burning ancient sunlight. The nitrogen in soils that suggests we fed fields with vigor. None of these are declarations carved with a chisel, they are pencil marks. And even pencil marks endure surprisingly well between pages that don't often turn. We might imagine a core lifted from a calm basin long after our houses are stories. The core is slender as a wrist, and banded like a tree. A half centimetre where the silt is a little darker, where tiny spheres of soot crowd together more than before, where glassy beads are unexpectedly common. Here and there, polymer threads are caught like cobweb on the grain ridges. A few mineral grains carry shapes that became widespread only when we learned how to make very hot, very clean fires. In a narrow interval, two modest peaks of certain isotopes appear, the chemical equivalent of two soft knocks on a door. Above that, a slow change, like season becoming another season but without the neat border of a calendar. The reader sets the core down, labels the intervals with plain names instead of grand ones, and writes in the margin, perhaps this is when they were busiest. We step back and let the scale reset. The earth is patient. It will metabolize much of what we scatter. Rubber weathers to grain. Steel returns to oxides. Glass becomes sand again with the help of waves. Concrete breaks, becomes small, and then becomes smaller. Electronics unweave into elements that are shy and elements that are sociable, traveling by water into resting places that suit their personalities. Burial happens to landfills too. They are, in a way, our quarries in reverse. Cuttings we fill, shelves we stack, trays we label, without meaning to. Future hills may contain careful cross-sections of habits. A season of toys, a season of packages, a season of something we wore, and then forgot. The catalogue won't be orderly. It doesn't have to be. Most libraries aren't. Meanwhile, our living maps become part of the geological ones. Roads, when abandoned, are quickly edited by roots and weather and tiny patient teeth, but their crushed stone lingers, a stripe of grain size and composition that says a line once insisted here. Railbeds tell similar stories. Canals silt, then become rivers that were not asked to be there. Their banks telling a different tale than streams that found their own way. Dams leave signatures of sudden lakes and sudden returns. Floodplains, alternately busy, then restful, their stacks counting decisions as much as years. Even our gardens, where soils were coaxed into openness and nutrient, may leave little sweet spots in future cores, patches of darker, kinder dirt caught beneath old brick, and the faint negative of a fence. Under cities, tunnels make trace fossils on the scale of burrows, clean arcs through bedrock that future readers might map as an echology of subways and drains. A hive of human engineering written as absence, then refilled, then absence again, when roofs collapse and make broader cavities that later are gently sealed. Pavements record raindrop prints in oil-dark films, then heal, then crack. Our feet leave nothing durable on asphalt, but our patterns commutes. Festivals, quiet mornings when the snow tamed the streets, will be traceable, for a while, in the fine reshuffling of dust. Some suggest this moment will carry the look of an epochal shift, a crisp line like the thin ash we met in earlier rooms. Others answer more cautiously. Perhaps the line will be a smear, a gradient, a change in tone rather than a page turn. The ocean's chemistry may keep a paragraph. The ice may keep its own. The rings of trees where forests stand long enough may record a narrow pulse of warmth or stress. The disagreement is comfortable. It invites more careful listening. We do not need to decide tonight whether a capital letter begins our era. Lowercase is tender and often truer. When we ask what will last of us, we could ask in another register, what do we wish to last? Beyond metals and glass and concrete and plastic, the answer might be quieter, a habit of care, if it can be preserved anywhere. The idea that a thing can be held gently and returned if asked, that labels should tell the whole story from origin to drawer, that permission is part of the work. These are not materials, they are methods. But sometimes methods leave signatures too, in sediments beneath a museum built to breathe slowly. Perhaps there is a thin, even layer of dust with fibers from brushes and hair from good days and skin cells from small noses pressed to glass, all settled together in a patient lamination that reads, "Many people came here to share a room with stone and light." Perhaps the message is simple. There were places where seeing was also resting. If we think of our digital conversations, their fossils are not the kind we can lift. They are storms of electrons, orders of code, archives that depend on devices and energy and agreements. Some will last, translated over and over into whatever counts as recall in future rooms. Some will not. It is not a failing if many do not. Stone does not trade well with light that fast. The Earth's best archives are slow on purpose. If the music of our hour must be transcribed for a different instrument, it may choose the instruments we cannot yet imagine. We can love the part of the song we hear now, and let the rest belong to tomorrow's hands. It might be comforting to think again of Bias, a friend who has quietly walked with us through every chapter. Our traces will favor places we made and visited often, coasts where we built, deltas we taught to sit still, lakes we ringed with houses and then left, basins where our factories inhaled and exhaled, caves where we hid and made art and soot. High mountains may remember us by absence. Deep ocean plains will file our letters under to be opened later. Desert winds will scour our messages, but salt pans may keep small, crisp echoes. Not fair, not unfair, just consistent. The archivist plays no favorites, except those written by physics. Perhaps on a very distant morning, someone will split a rock and find our shadows there in ways more symbolic than literal. An imprint of a boot's sole in a thin layer of river mud that was rapidly hardened by something unusual. Sun, chemistry, a fortunate sheet of ash, the mesh of a woven basket printed where it lay, and was then covered by a sill of sand. The mold of a bottle in a bank that slumped, and then sealed. A set of steps through a dusty plaza, hardened by an afternoon rain, that wrote delicately, and then left. The steps do not say who. They say someone. That may be enough. And if our bones do not often enter the library, we can be happy for that. We are well built for other archives, shared memory, stories told at tables, names penciled inside book covers, a laugh that wears a pattern into the air of a kitchen, a stubborn kindness people pass down without labeling. None of this will fossilize in stone. Much of it does not need to. The world has many kinds of keeping. We could, if still awake, play a small game of humble imagination. You are a geologist in a time far enough away that your calendar would look like poetry to me. You stand where our sea has stepped back or stepped forward. Coasts have always loved to rearrange themselves. You open a slice of old urban ground. Inside are alternating beds, rubble and dust, a layer dense with broken brick and tile, a pale lens of sand from a storm surge, a thin, dark glass glittering film, where fires burned for a week without sleep. A calmer sheet laid down while the city forgot to breathe so hard. Scattered through are signatures, a twist of wire now iron oxide, a cement clast that stubbornly resists your pick, a line of little globules that look like pearls but were born in a furnace. You smile, not triumphantly, just the way we smile when a letter from a friend arrives, with a smudge that proves it was really written by a hand. You close the drawer and make tea. We can take the kindness of that imagined reader as permission. Permission to be less worried about what will endure in rock and more attentive to what is resting well tonight. The breath you are taking is a kind of archive. The room's temperature is a gentle stratigraphy across your skin. The weight of your blanket is sediment settling. The quiet is an anoxic layer where busy thought cannot easily get purchase. You are, in this moment, practicing the same art the planet practices when it keeps what it loves. A slow, even holding. If the future keeps a letter from us, we hope it reads well. We hope it says, "They were inventive and prone to hurry." Yes, but they were also capable of stillness. They sometimes paused over a shell and traced its spiral with a thumb, and called that good. We hope the letter includes how we loved water, how we built beside it, because it sounded like sleep, how we told stories comparing blankets to silt and pillows to mud, how we recognized in a leaf turned to film something of our own desire to remain a silhouette someone else could understand. We end where we began, gently, with the moment after motion. Tonight, as you settle, think of the rivers still writing in ink you can't see, page after page, into basins where no one is watching. Think of a feather lowering itself into quiet and a thin coverlet arriving in time. Think of water learning the shape of bone in rooms where air is shy and patience is endless. Think of amber keeping a fly mid-thought, of ice holding a whiskers curve, of tar remembering a chorus, of salt persuading a story to stay crisp. Think of windows where soft parts linger, of hands that brush and label, and then step back so the fossil can keep resting, while being seen. Think of letters that arrive with their edges worn and still tell enough to make the heart slow down. Tomorrow will write a page of its own, maybe a footfall in damp sand, maybe a cup on a table that leaves a ring, maybe a kindness that no stone will ever store. And that's all right. Tonight, your task is easy. Let the day's busy molecules dissolve like the lighter parts of a leaf, leaving only a thin, dark film of calm. Let layers of quiet accumulate, breath upon breath, until your body is a comfortable archive of warmth. If anything from our era survives in stone, it will do so without our supervision. If anything worth keeping survives in you, it will do so now, under blankets, the archivist river whispering just beyond the edge of sleep. We have asked our question. The answer is a soft, permissive one. Most of what we are will return. A little of what we made may last. What matters most is the way we rest into the world that holds us. Close the book if you like. The shelf will remember where you stopped. The room knows how to keep you. The planet will turn its page without a sound. And you can finally drift. Welcomed by layers. Carried by gentle water. Preserved for this one long night in the tender geology of sleep.